Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the quietest corner of the room you can find, because tonight we are going somewhere that history books often describe with maps, dates, presidents, troop numbers, and arrows moving across a battlefield, but rarely with enough attention to what the war did inside the minds of the people who were sent to fight it. We're going to Vietnam. Not the Vietnam of speeches. Not the Vietnam of strategy rooms in Washington. Not the Vietnam of television anchors speaking over grainy footage. Not the Vietnam that gets reduced to whether America should have been there or should not have been there. We're going to the Vietnam that followed men home. The Vietnam that came back in their sleep. The Vietnam that sat with them at kitchen tables in Ohio, California, Texas, New York, Alabama, and everywhere in between. The Vietnam that lived in a man's hands when he heard a car backfire. The Vietnam that made a father stare too long out a window while his family tried to understand why he was in the house, but not fully there. And here is the thing that makes this story so difficult and so necessary. For many of the soldiers who fought there, the war did not end when they got on the plane home. The military could mark the tour complete. The paperwork could be stamped. The uniform could be folded away. A mother could hug her son at the airport. A wife could hold her husband at the doorway. A child could see his father again and think, at least for a moment, that everything had been restored. But inside the returning soldier, something had often been left unfinished. Something still watching the tree line. Still listening for the wrong sound. Still measuring every room for danger before he even knew he was doing it. That is the story we are telling tonight. Why the Vietnam War created a generation of traumatized soldiers. Not every soldier, because history is never that simple. Some men came home and rebuilt their lives with strength and steadiness. Some carried pain quietly and never received a diagnosis. Some rejected the language of trauma entirely. Some suffered in ways no one around them understood. But enough of them returned changed. Enough of them struggled with nightmares, anger, numbness, guilt, grief, drinking, silence, broken marriages, lost work, and memories that would not stay in the past, that the country eventually had to find a new language for what had happened to them. The official diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder did not enter the American Psychiatric Manual until 1980, and the research and advocacy surrounding returning Vietnam veterans played a critical role in that recognition. Before we step deeper into that story, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights low? Are you sitting on a couch after a long day? Are you somewhere quiet with a window open, maybe hearing traffic in the distance or the hum of a fan in the room? And if you have someone in your family who served in Vietnam, or someone who came back from any war different from how they left, you may already know that this is not just a story about history. It is a story about households. It is a story about the people who lived beside the war after the war was over. Wives who learned which questions not to ask. Children who sensed when a father's mood had changed before anyone said a word. Brothers who came home from overseas and could not explain why normal life felt so strange. Mothers who looked at sons they had raised and could see that the body had returned before the rest of him had caught up. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that quiet pull of history, it would mean a great deal if you hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something here makes you pause or think or remember somebody. And if you want to tell me where you're watching from tonight, or whether this subject connects to your own family history, leave it in the comments. I read those messages, and with a subject like this one, I think they matter. Now let us slow down and begin where the public version of the Vietnam War often begins, with numbers, because numbers are useful, but they are also a little dangerous. They can make something enormous easier to hold in the mind, and at the same time they can make it feel farther away. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, American military involvement in Vietnam began in February 1961 and lasted until May 1975, and about 2.7 million American men and women served in Vietnam during that period. More than 58,000 American service members lost their lives. Those numbers are repeated so often that they can become smooth from use, like stones in a pocket. 2.7 million, 58,000. You hear them, you understand that they are large, and then the mind moves on because it has to. But each of those numbers was made of individual people. A young man standing in line for a physical. A Marine stepping off a transport plane into heat that felt unlike anything he had known. A medic learning very quickly that courage did not mean the absence of fear. A door gunner looking down from a helicopter into a country he had been told was the front line of a global struggle, while also knowing that the people below him were farmers, children, old women, soldiers, civilians, enemies, allies, and sometimes impossible to separate from one another. That impossibility, that confusion between war as it was explained and war as it was lived, is one of the keys to understanding the trauma Vietnam produced. For a long time, Americans had inherited a very particular idea of what war was supposed to look like. It was not always accurate, of course, because war had always been awful, but the national memory of World War II gave many people a framework that felt clearer. There was a front line, there was an enemy army, there was surrender, there was a home front that largely supported the troops, there was victory, at least in the way people told the story afterward. Vietnam did not fit that shape. The enemy was not always visible. The battlefield was not always fixed. A road that seemed safe in the morning could be mined by afternoon. A village could appear friendly one day and dangerous the next. A child could be a child, and still a soldier might fear that the child was carrying information, or a grenade, or simply standing too close to a place where someone else had hidden a weapon. That kind of uncertainty wears on the nervous system in a way that is hard to explain, unless you imagine living inside it not for a day, not for a week, but month after month. The body is built to respond to danger. It can flood itself with energy, sharpen hearing, tighten muscles, make the eyes search for movement. That is useful when danger comes and goes. But in Vietnam, for many soldiers, danger did not arrive neatly. It seeped into everything. It could be in the path, in the grass, in the tree line, in the village, in the silence, in the absence of birds, in the sudden kindness of a stranger that might be kindness or might be warning. The soldier's body learned to stay ready because readiness could mean survival. The problem was that the body did not always unlearn it when the soldier came home. This is where the story becomes more than military history. It becomes the history of the human body under pressure. Post-traumatic stress disorder, as the Department of Veterans Affairs explains it today, can develop after a person experiences or witnesses a life-threatening or traumatic event, and if symptoms last more than a few months, it may be PTSD. That sentence sounds clinical, clean, almost too clean for what it is describing. In daily life, it could mean a man who wakes sweating because the room has become Vietnam before he is fully awake. It could mean avoiding fireworks on the 4th of July because everyone else hears celebration and he hears incoming fire. It could mean not sitting with his back to a door in a restaurant. It could mean feeling nothing at a son's birthday party and then feeling rage over something small 5 minutes later. It could mean guilt so heavy that it becomes part of the furniture of the mind. And because the diagnosis did not yet exist during most of the Vietnam era, many of these men were not told. Your brain and body are reacting to trauma. They were told, directly or indirectly, to get over it. They were told they were home now. They were told they were lucky. They were told other men had been through worse. Sometimes they told themselves those same things because the culture they came from had not given them many other tools. There is a phrase that appears again and again when people talk about Vietnam veterans. They came home alone. That does not mean literally alone in every case. Some were met by family. Some returned to bases. Some were welcomed warmly by people who loved them. But compared with earlier wars, there was no shared national ritual of return that could hold the meaning of what they had experienced. One man could be in a firefight in Vietnam and then, Within days, be standing in an American airport surrounded by strangers buying coffee, carrying luggage, complaining about delays. Think about the violence of that contrast for a moment. Not physical violence, but psychological violence. The mind has been living in a world where a careless step can kill you, where a friend can be alive at breakfast and gone before dark, where the rules of survival are severe and immediate. Then suddenly there are escalators, advertisements, polished floors, people laughing too loudly, people who do not know where you've been and do not really want to know. The war has not been metabolized. It has not been witnessed. It has simply been interrupted by normal life. And normal life, instead of feeling comforting, can feel obscene, too bright, too casual, too unaware of what the world is capable of doing. This was not only because of the battlefield, it was also because of the country they returned to. Vietnam was the first American war that television carried into living rooms night after night with such force. The public saw body bags, burning villages, exhausted soldiers, official statements that often did not seem to match what reporters were showing. The war divided families, campuses, churches, neighbourhoods. Some Americans saw the soldiers as victims of a bad policy. Some saw them as participants in something shameful. Some supported them completely. Some wanted the whole subject to disappear, and many returning veterans found themselves caught in a bitter space between the government that had sent them and the public that did not know what to do with them once they came back. Here is one of the cruelest parts of this history. A soldier could feel betrayed by the war itself, betrayed by the leadership that had described it in clean phrases, betrayed by the protesters who seemed to blame him personally, betrayed by civilians who asked shallow questions, and betrayed by his own silence because he could not find a way to say what had happened without reopening it. Trauma does not need betrayal in order to exist, but betrayal can deepen it. It can make a wound harder to close because the person carrying it no longer knows where to place the blame. And then there was the moral weight of the war. This is something we have to approach carefully, because it is easy to speak too broadly and unfairly about millions of different experiences. Not every soldier saw the same things. Not every soldier did the same things. Not every soldier came away with the same burden. But Vietnam placed many American troops in situations where the usual moral categories of civilian life became unstable. Search and destroy missions, free fire zones, body counts as a measure of success, the difficulty of distinguishing guerrilla fighters from civilians, the constant fear of ambush, and the pressure to survive all created conditions in which men could witness or participate in acts that later became almost impossible to reconcile with who they believed themselves to be. This is not the same as fear. Fear says, I might die. Moral injury says, what have I done? What did I allow? Why did I live when someone else did not? Why did I obey? Why did I fail to stop it? Those questions can sit in a person for decades. They do not always shout. Sometimes they wait until a quiet evening, until a child asks an innocent question, until an old man sees footage from the war on television and suddenly cannot remain in the room. What makes Vietnam especially important in the history of trauma is that it forced the United States to confront something soldiers from earlier wars had also known, but often lacked the language to explain. Men had come home haunted from the Civil War. They'd come home shaken from World War I, when people spoke of shell shock. They had come home exhausted from World War II, when the term battle fatigue was used. The names changed, but the pattern remained. War could enter the mind and stay there. The difference after Vietnam was that veterans, clinicians, activists and researchers pressed the issue until the country could no longer treat these reactions as weakness, cowardice, or private failure. The VA's history of PTSD notes that research involving returning Vietnam War veterans helped establish links between the trauma of war and post-military civilian life, contributing to PTSD being added to DSM-3 in 1980. That was not just a medical update, it was a cultural admission. It meant that something real had happened to these men and women, something that could be studied, named, treated and understood as an injury rather than a defect of character. But tonight, before we get to the studies, before we get to the clinics, before we get to the long fight to make people listen, I want to keep us with the human beginning of it. Picture a young man in the late 1960s. He may have volunteered, he may have been drafted, he may believe in the mission, he may not understand the mission at all. He may be patriotic, frightened, bored, proud, resentful, eager to prove himself, or simply carried along by a system much larger than him. He has probably grown up watching older men speak about service as something honourable and necessary. He has maybe watched war movies where soldiers are scared but still know what they are doing, where death has music under it, where the story ends before anyone has to figure out how to sleep afterward. He's trained, but training is not the same as being ready. He's given equipment, orders, a unit, a destination. He's told what to do with his weapon. He's told how to move, how to dig, how to patrol, how to respond. What no one can fully tell him is how to carry the smell of a battlefield after it is over. How to remember the face of a friend without remembering the moment that face changed. How to come home to a bedroom that looks exactly as it did before, and understand that he is the thing in the room that has become unfamiliar. There is something deeply unsettling about the age of many of these soldiers. They were old enough to be handed rifles and responsibility, but many were still close enough to childhood that their mothers had packed lunches for them only a few years earlier. Some had never travelled far from home before the military moved them across the world. Some had never seen serious injury. Some had never slept outside. Some had never been hated by anyone. Then they found themselves in a war where the weather itself felt hostile, where the jungle could hide anything, where exhaustion lowered judgment, where fear became routine, and where the calendar was counted not by seasons but by days left in country. That phrase, days left, mattered. Men counted down because the tour had an end date, and the end date became a private religion. If you could just make it to that number, you could go home. But the mind is not a calendar. It does not always stop because the tour stops. A man could leave Vietnam on schedule and still carry Vietnam on no schedule at all. So tonight we begin with a question that is simple only on the surface. Why did Vietnam create so much trauma? The answer is not one thing. It was the youth of the men sent there. It was the draft and the uneven burden of who went and who did not. It was the jungle and the weather and the mines and the ambushes. It was the absence of clear front lines. It was the pressure to survive in a war where civilians and enemies could blur in terrifying ways. It was the moral confusion of the mission. It was the rotation system that sent individuals home without their units, dropping them back into civilian life with almost no transition. It was the hostile or indifferent homecoming many experienced. It was the silence of families who loved them but did not know how to listen. It was the lack of a name for what was happening inside them. It was all of this together, layer upon layer, until a generation of veterans found themselves carrying a war that the country wanted to debate, forget, or simplify. And if we are going to understand that generation, we have to start before the jungle, before the firefight, before the nightmares, before the word PTSD, before the protests and the memorials and the old men sitting in veterans' halls with coffee cooling in front of them. We have to start with the moment a young man learned that the war had reached across the ocean and found his name. For some, that moment came in a draft notice. For others, it came in a recruiting office, or a family expectation, or a desire to choose the branch before the draft chose for them. However it came, it turned ordinary American boys into soldiers heading toward a war that would ask more of them than many of them had the years or language to understand. For many of the young men who went to Vietnam, the war did not begin with a gunshot. It began with an envelope. It began on an ordinary day when the mail arrived, when a mother sorted bills on the kitchen table, when a father came home from work, when a young man who had been thinking about cars, girlfriends, baseball, college, factory shifts, or simply getting through the week suddenly found that the government had reached into his life and changed its direction. The paper inside did not need to be dramatic. That was part of its power. It did not arrive with music under it. It did not announce itself as a historical turning point. It was an administrative document, a notice, a classification, a command to appear, a date to report, a reminder that his body now belonged partly to the nation. The United States had maintained a draft from 1948 until 1973, and the paperwork that followed a young man through the selective service system could include his draft registration, classification history, physical examination results, and entry into active duty. In other words, the road to Vietnam often began not in a training camp or on a runway, but in a filing cabinet in a local board office. I want you to picture him before anyone calls him a soldier. Not the man he might later become in photographs, thin from the heat, shirt open, helmet low, cigarette in one hand, rifle close enough that it feels like part of his body. Picture him before that. He is 18, 19, maybe 20. He still knows the rooms of his childhood home by muscle memory. He may have a bedroom with school trophies or old comic books still on a shelf. He may have a job pumping gas, loading trucks, working in a mill, standing behind a grocery counter, driving nails into lumber, or waiting tables in a town where everyone knows his parents. He may be the first in his family to consider college, or he may know college was never really on the table. He may have no strong opinion about Vietnam at all. That is something we forget. Later, everyone would speak as if the war had always been a national argument, as if every young man had spent years thinking through foreign policy, containment, communism, colonialism, and the politics of Southeast Asia. But many of the boys who were sent were not political philosophers. They were young Americans who had been told, in broad terms, that their country needed them and that refusing was shameful, illegal, or both. They were old enough to be judged as men, but many were still young enough that the world had not finished forming around them. Here is what is hard to hold in the mind at first. The trauma of Vietnam did not begin only when combat began. For some men, it began with the loss of control. It began with understanding that a decision had been made about them by people they would never meet. During much of the war, the draft system was shaped by local boards, deferments, classifications, medical exams, appeals, and complicated routes around service that were easier for some young men to navigate than others. College deferments mattered enormously. For most of the war, a full-time college student could often delay eligibility for induction, and that meant the burden of military service fell unevenly across class lines, because getting into college and staying there required money, preparation, family support, and a school record that many working-class young men did not have. Historians of the anti-war movement and the draft have repeatedly pointed out that these deferments intensified racial and socio-economic inequality in who was most likely to be sent. Sit with that for a moment, because it changes the emotional texture of the story. A young man from a family with savings, connections, information and expectations might find a path through college, graduate school, a medical deferment, a reserve unit, a National Guard slot, or some other shelter from the worst odds. A young man from a poorer family might not even know which questions to ask. He might not have a family doctor willing to document a condition. He might not have a lawyer. He might not have parents who understood how to challenge a classification. He might have left school already to earn wages his family needed. And so one boy's future was paused for lectures, exams, and campus life, while another boy's future was interrupted by basic training. That imbalance mattered. Imbalance. Not because every man who avoided combat was a coward, and not because every man who served was helpless. History is more complicated than that. It mattered because men can endure danger with less bitterness when they believe the burden is shared fairly. Vietnam often did not feel fair, and unfairness, when mixed with fear, can become a very durable kind of anger. The lottery system, introduced in 1969, was supposed to make selection feel more impartial by tying call-up order to birth dates. Young men watched or listened as dates were assigned numbers, and a low number could mean that the war had moved from a distant possibility to a near certainty. The Selective Service's own lottery tables show the strange coldness of the system, with birthdays reduced to numbered order, a calendar turned into a sorting machine for human lives. Imagine being a young man and suddenly discovering that the day you were born had become a military fact. A birthday, which had once meant cake, cards, family, and maybe a few dollars tucked into an envelope by an aunt, could now carry an entirely different meaning. September 14th, April 24th, December 30th. These were not just dates anymore, they were thresholds. A young man could sit in a living room with his parents and learn that the number attached to his birth date might decide whether he would be walking through rice paddies a year later. That is a strange way for adulthood to arrive, not through choice, not through a gradual taking on of responsibility, but through a public drawing in which chance itself seemed to wear a government uniform. There is something else that needs to be said carefully. Many young men did volunteer. Some volunteered out of patriotism. Some volunteered because their fathers had served in World War II or Korea, and the family expectation was clear. Some volunteered because they believed they would be drafted anyway, and wanted some control over branch or assignment. Some wanted to prove themselves. Some were drawn by benefits, training, travel, or escape from a town that felt too small. Some had no better economic option. So when we speak of young men being sent before they were ready, we are not speaking only of unwilling draftees dragged into uniform. We are speaking of a broader condition. A country took boys and young men, some willing and some not, and moved them through a system that could teach them to march, shoot, clean a rifle, obey orders, and survive inspections, but could not fully prepare them for what Vietnam would do to their sense of safety, morality, identity, and time. Basic training was designed to break down civilian habits and build military habits quickly. That was the point. A recruit learned to move when told, wake when told, eat when told, stand where told, answer how told, and stop thinking of himself as an isolated individual. The haircut mattered, the uniform mattered, the shouting mattered, the insults, the drills, the repetition, the stripping away of privacy, the sudden loss of personal preference. All of it served a purpose. The military needed civilians transformed into soldiers fast enough to feed a growing war. But there is a difference between discipline and readiness. You can teach a young man to assemble a weapon under pressure. You can teach him to respond to commands. You can teach him how to crawl under wire, throw a grenade, identify rank, keep his boots in order, and stay awake when his body begs for sleep. None of that necessarily teaches him how to watch a friend die and remain himself afterward. None of it teaches him what to do when fear has lived in his body so long that peace feels suspicious. None of it teaches him how to come home from a war whose purpose even many adults could not explain without arguing. The army itself later recognised that the Vietnam system created serious training and cohesion problems. One official army history described the 2-year draft obligation and the 12-month Vietnam tour as a combination that aggravated training, because soldiers who gained experience in combat often did not have enough time left in service to train others or season new units outside the combat area. The same history noted that the 12-month tour and personnel losses produced heavy turnover and a constant demand on the training establishment. That sounds like administrative language, but inside it is a human reality. Men were always arriving, always leaving, always counting days, always learning from someone who might be gone soon. A squad was not a fixed family for the duration of the war. It was a moving doorway. Someone stepped in green and frightened, and someone else stepped out hollow-eyed and almost free. The new man had to learn quickly, and in Vietnam, learning slowly could get you killed. Think about what that meant psychologically. In earlier wars, units often trained together, deployed together, suffered together, and came home together, though even that was never as neat as memory makes it sound. In Vietnam, the individual rotation system meant that a soldier's war was measured by his own tour, not necessarily by the life of a stable unit. A man arrived alone or in a small group. The men already there looked at him and saw inexperience, bad luck, maybe danger, because new men made mistakes. He learned the local rules not from a manual, but from exhausted men who had survived long enough to sound casual about things that should never have become casual. Do not stand there. Do not touch that. Do not walk point like that. Do not trust the quiet. Do not bunch up. Do not talk too loud. Do not think the village is safe because children are smiling. Do not think the trail is safe because someone used it yesterday. These lessons entered him through fear, and just when he became one of the men who knew, just when he had absorbed the habits that might keep him alive, he was closer to leaving, and another new man would arrive with clean gear and eyes that had not yet learned the landscape. An army study of post-Vietnam training reform later quoted historian Russell Wagley's judgment that officers and men rotated in and out so rapidly that combat units had little chance to accumulate knowledge of the enemy and country, or build cohesion inside companies, platoons and squads. That one word, cohesion, deserves attention. It sounds technical. It is not. Cohesion is whether you trust the man beside you. It is whether you know how he reacts when firing starts. It is whether he knows when you're too tired to think clearly. It is whether a small group of men becomes something more protective than a list of names. When cohesion is weak, fear has fewer places to go. It stays trapped inside the individual, and a 19-year-old carrying fear alone will often build a hard shell around it. That shell may help him survive in the moment. It may also make it very difficult for him to become open, relaxed, affectionate or honest later. Now add another layer to this. The war expanded at a pace that strained the military's ability to fill the ranks, and as manpower demands grew, standards themselves became part of the story. Project 100,000, launched under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1966, lowered entry standards and allowed hundreds of thousands of men who previously would not have qualified to enter the armed forces. A George Mason University dissertation summary describes the program as lasting from October 1966 to December 1971, and bringing approximately 346,000 men into service across all branches under lowered standards. This was presented in part as an opportunity program, a way to give poor and undereducated men training and a chance at advancement. But in practice, many of these men were being fed into a wartime machine that was already hard enough on the most prepared recruits. Some served honourably and capably. Some were protected by leaders who understood their limitations. Some struggled badly. The moral problem was not that these men lacked worth. The moral problem was that the government used their limited options as a manpower solution. This is the part of the story where the language of patriotism often becomes too smooth. We hear phrases like service, duty, sacrifice, and national interest. Those words can be meaningful. They can also hide the machinery underneath. A country at war needs bodies. It needs clerks and cooks and truck drivers and infantrymen and radio operators and medics and mechanics and door gunners. It needs replacements for the wounded, the dead, the sick, the transferred, the men whose tours are ending. The system does not pause long enough to ask whether each 18-year-old has a strong enough inner life to carry what he is about to see. It does not ask whether his family has taught him how to speak about fear. It does not ask whether he has ever been responsible for another human life. It does not ask whether he has the emotional vocabulary to describe guilt. It asks whether he can be processed, trained, assigned, shipped, and used. For the young men themselves, this transition could be bewilderingly fast. One season they were civilians. The next, they were in fatigues. They learned slang, ranks, punishments, routines. They learned to joke in ways that kept panic from showing. They learned to hide softness because softness could be dangerous in a culture built around toughness. They learned that complaining too much made them weak, but saying nothing made them lonely. They learned that everyone was afraid, and almost no one wanted to be the first to admit it. This is not a small detail. Trauma grows more dangerous when people are forbidden, formally or informally, from speaking honestly about what is happening to them. The military of the 1960s was not built to ask a private how his nervous system was adapting to prolonged threat. It was built to keep him functioning. Functioning is not the same as healing. Functioning means the patrol goes out. Functioning means the weapon is cleaned. Functioning means the man gets on the helicopter. Functioning can continue for a long time while the person inside is quietly being altered. A great deal of this alteration came from the mismatch between what young men had been told war was and what they found when they arrived. Many had grown up in the shadow of World War II memory. Their fathers, uncles, teachers, coaches, and neighbours had lived through a war that, in American memory, had become a clear moral story. That memory was simplified, of course. World War II was full of terror, trauma, moral compromise, and lifelong wounds. But to boys growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s, it often appeared as a story of courage, unity, victory, and return. Vietnam offered no such clarity. There was no Berlin to enter, no enemy capital to capture, no surrender ceremony that could tell a young soldier his suffering had purchased something final. He might fight for a hill and leave it days later. He might search a village and never know who had warned whom. He might lose a friend to a mine placed by someone he never saw. He might be told progress was being made while the same area had to be swept again and again. For a young mind trained on the idea that war had a beginning, mission, and victory, Vietnam could feel like being dropped into a task that renewed itself every morning no matter what had been paid the day before. This was especially brutal for boys who still needed adults to make sense of the world. And yes, legally they were men. The law could draft them, train them, deploy them, punish them, and decorate them. But emotional development does not obey legal categories. A 19-year-old may have courage. He may have strength. He may act with astonishing loyalty under fire. He may save lives. He may carry the wounded. He may become, in the eyes of his unit, dependable beyond question. None of that means he is finished becoming a person. The brain and identity of a young adult are still forming around experience. Put that young adult in an environment of chronic danger, grief, moral confusion, and sleep deprivation, and the war does not simply interrupt his development. It can become part of the foundation. Later, when he tries to build a civilian life on top of it, the foundation may shift under him. The family back home often imagined training as preparation in the simplest sense. Their son was not going straight from the porch to the jungle. He would have instructors. He would learn. He would be toughened. That thought comforted parents because it had to, but training could only approximate reality. It could teach a recruit to fire at targets, but the enemy in Vietnam did not always present himself as a target. It could teach him to follow orders, but it could not resolve what would happen when orders and conscience came into conflict. It could teach first aid, but it could not prepare a medic for the moment he had to choose who might live when there were too many wounded. It could teach patrol formation, but it could not teach what months of watching the ground for mines would do to a man after he returned to sidewalks, grocery stores, and children's toys scattered on a living room floor. The body remembers patterns it needed for survival. If every step once mattered, then every step can keep mattering long after the danger has passed. There was also the matter of masculinity, and we cannot understand the trauma without it. These young men came from a culture where manhood was often defined by control, courage, endurance, and silence. A man did not break down. A man did not tremble. A man did not admit he was afraid unless he did it as a joke. A man did not come home and tell his mother that he could still smell blood in his sleep. A man did not tell his wife that he felt safer in the garage than in bed. A man did not tell his children that their sudden movements made his heart race. So the training before Vietnam was not only military, it was cultural. Many had been trained since childhood to mistake silence for strength. Then they were sent into a war that required silence afterward just to remain socially acceptable. This is one reason so much pain stayed hidden. It had nowhere respectable to go. And yet, we should not picture these young men only as victims. That would flatten them. Many were funny, stubborn, inventive, brave, reckless, loyal, foolish, tender, cruel, scared, and generous in the mixed proportions of actual human beings. They wrote letters home that left out the worst parts. They taped photographs inside lockers. They made jokes about food, weather, officers, and the absurdity of military life. They formed friendships with a speed that civilian life rarely requires. They learned competence quickly because survival demanded it. They carried each other's ammunition, shared cigarettes, argued over music, invented nicknames, and remembered tiny details about home with painful clarity. A young man who could barely explain Vietnam in political terms might be able to tell you exactly how his mother's kitchen smelled on Sunday morning, exactly which streetlight flickered outside his girlfriend's house, exactly what kind of car he wanted when he got back. The more uncertain the war became, the more important those small facts became. They were proof that somewhere, away from the heat and mud and noise, he had a life that still belonged to him, but the problem was that the war began claiming parts of that life before he knew what was happening. It claimed his sleep first, perhaps, then his sense of safety, then his assumptions about adults, authority, justice, and luck. It taught him that a man could do everything right and die anyway. It taught him that survival might depend on suspicion. It taught him that tenderness was dangerous if it made loss harder, and loss was coming sooner or later. It taught him to compress feeling into action, keep moving, return fire. Call it in, load the wounded, count the men, watch the tree line, clean the weapon, do not think too long. Thinking too long was a luxury. Later, at home, when there was nothing urgent to do, the thoughts could return with interest. This is why the phrase "before they were ready" matters so much. It does not mean they were untrained in the narrow military sense. Many were trained intensely. Many became capable soldiers. It means they were sent before they had the years, context, emotional tools, and social permission to carry the kind of experience they were about to receive. They were trained to enter the war. They were not trained to survive themselves after the war. And the country that sent them was not ready either. It was not ready to receive their memories, not ready to admit the moral confusion, not ready to provide language for trauma, not ready to separate the young man in uniform from the policy that had placed him there. A generation of soldiers was being formed in real time by a system that understood manpower far better than it understood aftermath. So let us bring one of them back into view. He has finished training. He has learned enough to pass through the system. He has been issued gear. His orders are no longer theoretical. Vietnam is no longer a word in newspapers or on television. It is a destination printed on paperwork, spoken by sergeants, murmured by other men in transit. Maybe he writes one more letter home. Maybe he says he is fine. Maybe he believes he is fine because nothing has happened yet. He boards a plane with other young men who are trying to act older than they feel. Some sleep. Some talk too loudly. Some stare ahead. Some make jokes that are not really jokes. Somewhere in the long hours over the Pacific, the life they knew moves behind them, and the war they cannot yet imagine moves closer. Then the aircraft descends, the door opens, and the first thing that reaches them is the heat, heavy and immediate, carrying the smell of fuel, damp earth, vegetation, sweat, and distance from home. The training is over now. The place itself will begin teaching them, and Vietnam will prove to be a teacher that never lets the mind rest. The first lesson Vietnam taught many American soldiers was that the country itself could not be treated as background. It was not just the place where the war happened. It was part of how the war worked. A young man who had spent his life in Ohio or Georgia or Massachusetts might arrive thinking of Vietnam as a word on the news, a shaded shape on a map, a place that politicians and officers discussed in terms of communism, strategy, credibility, and containment. Then the aircraft door opened and the place became physical. Heat came first, then damp air, then the smell of fuel, mud, vegetation, cooking smoke, human sweat and rot, then the noise, helicopters, engines, insects, Men shouting over machinery. The steady sense that everything was too bright, too wet, too close, too unfamiliar. It is difficult to overstate what this meant to a nervous system already under pressure. Before a soldier ever saw combat, Vietnam had begun telling his body that it was somewhere it did not understand. We often use the word jungle as if it explains everything, but Vietnam was not one single landscape. That is one of the first corrections history requires. There were mountains, coastal lowlands, rubber plantations, rice paddies, river deltas, mangrove swamps, villages, roads, base camps, and cities. There were stretches of thick forest where visibility could shrink to a few yards, and there were open paddies where a man could feel exposed in every direction. Vietnam's climate varied by region, but heat, heavy rainfall, monsoon seasons, high humidity, and dense vegetation were part of the physical reality that many troops had to live and operate inside. Britannica describes northern Vietnam's summer as a season of heat, heavy rainfall, and occasional typhoons, while central and southern Vietnam were shaped by monsoon winds, rains, typhoons, and high temperatures in the dry months. It also notes Vietnam's wide range of forests, mangroves, palms, bamboo, vines, and dense plant life. Those facts sound clean on a page. On the ground, they meant boots that never fully dried, uniforms stiff with salt and mud, skin that broke open from moisture, feet damaged by immersion, gear that grew heavy, weapons that required constant care, and sleep that never felt complete because the air itself seemed to press on the body. Imagine being told to move through a place where the ground is not simply ground. It can be mud that pulls at your boots, a paddy dyke too narrow for comfort, a slope slick from rain, a trail that may have been used by farmers, guerrillas, children, or all three. The American soldier had been trained to think in terms of direction, formation, objective, and enemy contact. Vietnam kept complicating those categories. A path could look ordinary and still be dangerous. A clearing could feel like relief, and then feel like exposure. Thick vegetation could hide movement, but it could also hide absence. And absence itself became something to study. Men learned to notice what was missing. No children on the road, no farmers in the field, no cooking smoke from a village that should have been active, no birds, no dogs, no sound at all. Silence was not peaceful. Silence could mean someone was waiting. This is one reason the jungle, in the broad way soldiers often use that word, never let the mind rest. It forced attention outward every minute. A man on patrol could not simply walk. He had to scan the ground, the trees, the edges of the trail, the man ahead of him, the man behind him, the sound of insects, the shape of a mound of dirt, the angle of a branch, the strange placement of a piece of wire, the smell of smoke, the movement of grass. The body was doing more than moving through terrain. It was reading terrain for signs of death. That kind of attention is useful in war, but it is expensive. Human beings are not built to stay in that state indefinitely. The muscles tighten, the jaw sets, the stomach changes. Sleep becomes lighter. Irritation rises faster. The mind begins to prefer suspicion because suspicion feels safer than trust. And when suspicion keeps you alive, it becomes very difficult to call it a problem later. There is a simple, modern comparison that helps, though it is still inadequate. Think about the last time you walked through a dark parking lot and felt uneasy. Maybe you listened more carefully. Maybe you held your keys differently. Maybe you looked over your shoulder more than once. Now imagine that feeling lasting for hours. Now imagine it lasting for a year. Now imagine that sometimes the danger is real, sometimes it is not, and you will not know which until after you have already reacted. That was one of the central psychological conditions of Vietnam for many infantrymen and Marines. The danger was not constant in the sense that bullets were always flying. Long stretches could be boring, wet, uncomfortable, and repetitive. But the possibility of sudden violence was constant enough that the body learned never to dismiss it. The enemy understood this. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army did not need to fight the kind of war American soldiers expected in order to harm them. In fact, avoiding that kind of war was often the point. A US State Department analysis from the early 1960s described Viet Cong strength as deeply connected to villages, local supplies, recruits, guerrilla organization, and access to the countryside. It also noted that in many areas the Viet Cong had overt or covert administrations, sometimes functioning at night while the South Vietnamese government functioned by day. For the American soldier on the ground, this meant the war was not only out in the jungle, it was in the relationship between a village and the surrounding fields, between daylight and night, between the person who sold food in the morning and the person who carried information after dark. The enemy could be a uniformed regular soldier in a bunker complex, but he could also be someone who vanished back into ordinary life before American troops arrived. This did not make every villager an enemy. That distinction matters. Most civilians were trying to survive between forces larger than themselves. But the soldier on patrol often had no reliable way to know who had laid a mine, who had warned a guerrilla unit, who had been forced to cooperate, who was afraid, who was neutral, and who was simply tired of foreign men walking through the place where his family lived. That uncertainty created a particular kind of mental strain. It was not only fear of being killed, it was fear of being wrong. Wrong in trusting someone, wrong in ignoring a warning sign, wrong in firing, wrong in not firing, wrong in assuming a road was clear, wrong in assuming a child was only a child, wrong in assuming an old woman knew nothing, wrong in assuming every face was hostile. A conventional battlefield may produce terror, but it at least offers clearer categories. Vietnam often denied that clarity. The soldier had to make decisions quickly in a place where slow understanding might come too late, and then he had to live with those decisions afterward. The ground itself added to this pressure because it could be weaponized. Mines and booby traps were not a side detail of the war. They shaped the daily experience of many units. A Human Rights Watch report drawing on US military and Pentagon records described mines in Vietnam as a major weapon system and cited figures stating that landmines caused 33% of all US casualties in Vietnam, with 28% of US deaths officially attributed to mines. The same report noted that the 1st Marine Division reported 57% of its casualties during the last half of 1968 came from mines and booby traps. Even if a particular patrol never made contact with an enemy fighter, every step could still feel like a question. That question was not abstract. Is the next step safe? Is that can discarded trash or a trigger? Is that patch of ground disturbed because of rain, because of an animal, or because someone buried an explosive there last night? This kind of threat changes how men move. It slows them down. It makes them irritable. It makes them superstitious. It gives certain objects power. A trail, a doorway, a pile of brush, a cooking pot, a body, a bicycle, a clump of grass, an empty ration can. Anything could become suspicious because enough things had been made dangerous before. And one of the most corrosive features of mines and booby traps was that they removed the visible enemy from the moment of injury. A firefight at least gave a soldier someone to shoot at. A mine gave him only the explosion and the aftermath. The person who placed it might be miles away, asleep, dead, or working in a field. There was no face for the anger to attach to. The unit still had to move, the wounded still had to be carried, the evacuation still had to be called. The men still had to look at the ground and keep going. For the newer soldiers, this was especially hard. In the last part of the story, we talked about the young men who arrived before they were ready. In the jungle, readiness was often measured by small habits, and those habits had to be learned quickly. The new man might step where he should not step. He might bunch up too close to others. He might make too much noise. He might fail to read the body language of older men who had already learned to lower themselves slightly before an open stretch, or pause when the trail changed texture, or distrust a place that looked too easy to pass. Nobody had to give a lecture. The lesson might come in a hissed warning, a hand on the shoulder, an insult, a joke meant to cover fear, or in the worst cases, an injury that taught everyone at once. This was education by consequence. It worked quickly, and it left marks. There was also the simple exhaustion of living outdoors in a hostile climate. We sometimes describe soldiers as if combat is the only thing that harms them, but the daily grind of the environment matters. Wet socks, leeches, mosquitoes, heat rash, rotting clothes, hunger at strange times, bad water, the weight of ammunition, radio batteries, grenades, ponchos, rations and weapons. The smell of one's own body after days without proper washing, the struggle to sleep while damp, the need to stay alert when every part of the body wants to shut down. A tired soldier can become careless, but a soldier in Vietnam could not afford carelessness, so fatigue and alertness fought inside the same body. That is a miserable combination. The body wants rest, the war says no. At night, the pressure changed form rather than disappearing. Darkness in Vietnam did not simply mean the day was over. It could mean the enemy had more freedom to move. It could mean listening posts, perimeter duty, trip flares, claymores, whispered passwords, sudden illumination rounds, mortar fire, or the long wait for something that might not happen. A man might lie still in the dark with insects crawling nearby, hearing every sound as possible movement. In civilian life, nighttime is supposed to lower the body into sleep. In Vietnam, nighttime often asked the body to become sharper. That reversal mattered. When a soldier later came home and found himself awake at 3 a.m, listening to a house settle, unable to accept that the sound was only plumbing or wind, part of him was still obeying the night rules of Vietnam. There were places where the war went underground, and those places added their own kind of fear. The tunnel systems used by Viet Cong forces became one of the most unnerving features of the conflict for American troops. The National Museum of the United States Army describes tunnel complexes as small, unknown, irregular spaces, often only about 2 feet by 3 feet, with zigzagging sections and no two layouts the same. It also notes that bombing could be ineffective against them, that dogs could not avoid booby traps underground, and that the soldiers who entered them needed unusual mental toughness, because crawling for hours in claustrophobic darkness while expecting danger could break down even brave men. Think about that for a moment in plain human terms. A soldier, often one of the smallest men in a unit, might be asked to lower himself into a hole in the earth with a flashlight, a pistol, a knife, and no real knowledge of what waited ahead. The tunnel could contain documents, weapons, food, medical supplies, an enemy fighter, a trap, a snake, nothing at all, or some combination of these. The man above ground could see daylight. The man below had to keep moving through heat, darkness, dust, and the sound of his own breathing. Even soldiers who never entered tunnels knew what they represented. They meant the enemy might be beneath the ground after an area seemed cleared. They meant a quiet patch of earth could hide a whole system. They meant control was uncertain. American forces could dominate the air with helicopters, jets, artillery, and logistics, and still find that the enemy had adapted by becoming harder to see, harder to hold, harder to force into the open. This mismatch between American power and local elusiveness fed frustration. The United States could destroy a tree line, clear a zone, call in air support, and move massive amounts of men and equipment. But a soldier on the ground still had to walk, still had to step, still had to look into the brush, still had to sleep near the perimeter, and wonder what the darkness was hiding. The helicopter, one of the defining images of the Vietnam War, added another layer to this strange relationship between movement and fear. Helicopters gave American forces mobility across difficult terrain. Men could be lifted into landing zones, supplied, evacuated, reinforced, and moved faster than earlier armies could have imagined. But for the soldier riding inside, the helicopter could become a machine of transitions too abrupt for the mind to process. One moment he was in the air above green country, engine noise so loud that speech became difficult. Then the aircraft dropped toward a clearing, and the world became dust, rotor wash, shouted commands, and the possibility that the landing zone was not as quiet as it looked. A man could be delivered into danger in seconds. Later, the same machine might carry away the wounded. The sound of rotors could mean rescue, arrival, fear, relief, or grief, depending on the hour. It is no wonder that many veterans remembered that sound with such force. It had been tied to too many meanings at once. The jungle also changed time. On paper, time was organised by missions, patrols, operations, watches, and days left in country. In the field, time could stretch and collapse. Waiting for an ambush that never came could make minutes feel heavy. A sudden firefight could compress everything into seconds. A long, wet march could erase the calendar. The countdown to going home could become both comfort and torment. Men spoke of being short when they were near the end of their tour, and that shortness changed behaviour. A soldier with only weeks left could become cautious, even superstitious. He had survived too much to risk a careless final day. The mine statistics and stories that circulated through units made that fear rational. There were men who were injured or killed near the end. Everyone knew some version of that story, so time itself became dangerous. The closer home came, the more unbearable the possibility of not reaching it felt. This is one of the quieter sources of trauma. Hope can make fear worse. A man who has stopped imagining the future may move through danger in one way. A man who can almost see home moves through danger differently. He thinks of his mother waiting, his wife counting days, the car he will buy, the first meal he wants, the child he has not yet held. Each imagined future becomes something the jungle might take from him, so he protects himself by not thinking about it too much. Or he thinks about it constantly and suffers for it. Either way, the mind is working under strain. Inside units, men developed rituals to manage this strain. They checked equipment repeatedly. They carried lucky objects. They avoided certain words. They joked at terrible moments. They gave nicknames to places and people. They hardened themselves against the new arrivals because growing attached meant more pain if the new man died. They developed quick readings of who could be trusted. They learned to sleep when sleep was available, eat when food was available, and keep private fear hidden under sarcasm. These rituals were not childish. They were survival tools. But survival tools can become habits, and habits formed in war can be hard on civilian life. A man who learned not to feel too much in Vietnam might come home and find that his family experiences the same habit as coldness. A man who learned to react instantly to danger might come home and find that his anger arrives before his words do. A man who learned to distrust quiet might come home and find silence unbearable. The jungle did not create trauma by itself. No landscape has that power in isolation. What harmed soldiers was the combination of environment, enemy tactics, youth, uncertainty, moral pressure, and duration. The heat made sleep harder. Lack of sleep made fear sharper. Mines made movement frightening. Guerrilla tactics made civilians difficult to read. Difficult civilian encounters increased guilt and suspicion. Suspicion made loneliness worse. Loneliness made men depend intensely on the few people around them. Then casualties broke those attachments. And because the war had no clear front line, there was often no reliable mental place to put the fear. The base camp could be attacked. The road could be mined. The village could shift overnight. The trail could kill. The ground could kill. The quiet could kill. When almost anything can become dangerous, the mind begins to treat almost everything as dangerous. This is why coming home did not simply solve the problem. A nervous system trained by Vietnam did not instantly trust American normality. The body that had studied trails studied sidewalks. The eyes that had scanned tree lines scanned rooftops, crowds, restaurant doors, highway shoulders. The ears that had listened for mortars listened for fireworks, thunder, engines, dropped pans, children's toys cracking against the floor. Family members might say, "You're home now," and mean it with love. The veteran's body might answer, "Not yet, not fully, not where it counts." The jungle had trained him too well. Bring him back into the field for one more moment. He's walking in a line of men, spaced out because bunching together can turn one blast into several casualties. His shirt is soaked. His shoulders ache. His feet hurt. He has been bitten by insects so many times he no longer notices each bite separately. He watches the man ahead of him because that man's body may warn him before words do. He watches the ground because the ground may not be what it seems. He watches the trees because the trees can hide movement. He listens to the silence because silence can mean warning. He's 19 or 20, but he has learned to carry himself like someone much older. Not wiser exactly, just more guarded. And this is what the war is doing to him even before the next shot is fired. It is teaching him that safety is temporary, that rest is risky, that trust must be earned by every inch of ground, and that the mind must remain awake even when the body is desperate to sleep. And then, as the patrol moves closer to a village, another problem begins to take shape, one that may be even harder to carry than fear of the jungle. The men are not entering empty terrain. They're entering a place where people live, cook, farm, bury their dead, hide their sons, feed whichever armed force has power that night, and try to survive the attention of everyone. The American soldier has to look at those people and decide very quickly and often with very little information what they mean to him. Civilian, enemy, victim, informer, parent, threat, child, stranger. The jungle kept his body on alert, but the villagers would test something even deeper, because Vietnam was not only a war of terrain, it was a war where the enemy could be invisible, and where the attempt to find him could damage the soldier's sense of right and wrong in ways that did not end when the patrol was over. By the time the young soldier had learned to listen to the jungle, another lesson was waiting for him, and this one was harder because it did not live in the trees or the mud or the heat. It lived in faces. It lived in the moment when a patrol entered a village and every ordinary human detail became uncertain. A woman bending over a cooking pot. An old man standing beside a doorway. Children watching from the edge of a path. A farmer with his eyes lowered. A boy who ran too quickly. A girl who did not run at all. A house with rice stored inside. A tunnel entrance hidden nearby. A path used by everyone in daylight and by guerrillas at night. The soldier had been trained to find the enemy, but Vietnam kept asking him a question that training could not answer with any comfort. What does an enemy look like when he is not wearing a uniform, when he may have put down his weapon an hour before, when he may be standing beside his family, when he may be frightened, when he may be innocent, when he may be all of those things at different times? This is where certainty began to die. Not all at once, not dramatically, more like a lantern burning lower each night until the room is still visible but nothing has sharp edges anymore. The American soldier knew in the abstract that he was fighting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. The labels were clear enough on maps, in briefings, in reports, in military language. But on the ground, especially in the villages and rural areas of South Vietnam, those labels could blur very quickly. A US State Department intelligence paper from 1962 described the Viet Cong not only as regular and irregular forces, but as a movement supported by sympathizers, political cadres, local organization, and village-level structures that could operate in the countryside. It estimated regular forces, irregular forces, and a much larger body of supporters and sympathizers, a detail that shows how deeply the war reached into civilian space. For the soldier walking into that world, the enemy was not simply ahead of him. The enemy might be around him, beneath him, behind him, or nowhere at all. That last possibility mattered more than people think. There were many patrols and sweeps where American troops found nothing, or almost nothing. No large enemy formation, no clear firefight, no satisfying contact that proved the operation had mattered. They moved through villages, tree lines, paddies and trails, sweating under gear, alert to every sound, only to find abandoned bunkers, old footprints, caches that may or may not have been recent, or people who insisted they knew nothing. Then, later, a mine exploded on a path that had seemed empty, or a shot came from a tree line and the shooter vanished, or mortars landed on a base camp from a position no one had found in time. The absence of the enemy did not make men feel safe. It made them feel watched. Here is something modern people sometimes misunderstand about guerrilla war. It is not simply a smaller version of conventional war. It is a different kind of pressure. In a conventional battle, terror may be overwhelming, but the enemy's presence is often at least visible enough to be named. There is a line, a formation, a uniform, a tank, a trench, a flag, a position to attack or defend. Vietnam included conventional battles too, especially against North Vietnamese regular forces, and those battles could be brutal. But much of the psychological strain for American soldiers came from operating in a war where guerrilla forces could choose when to appear and when to melt away. The US Marine Corps History Journal has described Vietnam as a hybrid theatre, requiring Americans and South Vietnamese forces to fight both Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese conventional forces. That hybrid nature meant a soldier could spend 1 week expecting a battalion-sized clash, and the next week searching a village for a political organizer no one would identify. The scale kept changing. The rules kept changing. The emotional footing kept slipping. Let us step into a village for a moment, carefully, because this is where the war becomes most uncomfortable to look at. The village is not an empty stage for American fear. It is a place where Vietnamese families live under pressures most Americans could barely understand. The people there may have had relatives in the South Vietnamese army, relatives with the Viet Cong, relatives killed by American firepower, relatives killed by communist forces, relatives who wanted only to harvest rice and survive whoever arrived with guns that day. They may have been threatened by one side at night and questioned by another side in the morning. They may have given food because they believed in the cause, because they were forced, because they were afraid, because they were paid, because refusing was more dangerous than cooperating, or because the distinction between politics and survival had long since collapsed. So when an American soldier looked at a villager and wondered, "Are you helping them?" the true answer might not have fit into yes or no. That did not make the soldier's fear imaginary. It made it worse. Fear becomes easier to direct when the object is clear. A man shooting at you from a bunker is a direct threat. A road that may be mined is more difficult. A civilian population that may contain fighters, informants, unwilling collaborators, grieving parents, and neutral bystanders is harder still. The soldier's mind had to simplify because danger required fast judgment. But every simplification came at a cost. If he assumed too much innocence, he might die. If he assumed too much guilt, someone else might. That is not a dilemma a 19-year-old should have to solve while exhausted, armed, frightened, and responsible for the lives of the men around him. The military tried to solve uncertainty with systems, search operations, cordon and search, pacification, intelligence networks, Hamlet programs, body counts, maps, free fire zones, rules of engagement, reports that converted confusion into language that could travel upward through command. But language can make war appear more orderly than it is. The official US Army history of Vietnam describes search and destroy operations as efforts to locate and destroy enemy forces, often by moving into enemy base areas and trying to inflict casualties before the enemy could escape. It also notes that by 1966 American forces were fighting a war of attrition and, for a time, relying on body counts as one standard indicator of progress. Think about that from the point of view of a young soldier. If success is measured by enemy killed, but the enemy is often invisible, then the pressure to identify bodies as enemy bodies becomes more than paperwork. It becomes part of the moral atmosphere of the war. Body count sounds like a bureaucratic phrase, but it carried weight. Numbers could prove a unit had done its job. Numbers could justify an operation. Numbers could reassure commanders that the enemy was being worn down. Numbers could appear in briefings far from the field. But numbers also had a way of flattening human beings. A dead person became enemy killed in action, or civilian casualty, or accidental death, or something not counted clearly at all. For the soldier on the ground, the body was not a number at first. It was a body. It had clothes, age, hands, maybe no weapon nearby, maybe a weapon placed beside it, maybe a weapon removed by someone else, maybe no way to know. The report needed certainty. The ground rarely provided it. This is one of the hidden injuries of Vietnam. Not simply that men saw death, though they did. Not simply that they caused death, though some did. It was that they often had to interpret death under conditions where certainty was unavailable, and then live with the interpretation. Was the man running because he was Viet Cong, or because men with rifles had entered his village? Was the woman carrying rice to feed guerrillas, or to feed her children? Was the adolescent boy a lookout, or just a frightened boy? Was the old man silent because he was hiding something, because he was angry, because he did not understand, because he had survived too much to speak? These questions could not always be answered at the time, but they could return years later with terrible patience. And then there were free fire zones, one of those phrases that sounds almost abstract until you imagine being a civilian inside or near one, or a soldier told what that designation meant. During Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, for example, an official US Army account states that once the Iron Triangle area was depopulated, much of it would be turned into a free fire zone, allowing US forces to fire on suspected targets without first obtaining permission from South Vietnamese authorities. On a map, that may look like control. On the ground, it was another way certainty became manufactured rather than discovered. If civilians had been ordered out, then anyone remaining could be treated with suspicion. But war does not move civilians with the neatness of a line drawn on paper. People hide, people return, people misunderstand orders. People are too old to move easily. People have livestock, graves, homes, fields, and fear of what will happen if they leave. A soldier entering such a zone could be told, in effect, that the space itself had changed the moral category of whoever remained. That is an enormous burden to place on exhausted young men, and on the civilians trapped inside the logic of the war. It is worth saying plainly that many American soldiers tried to behave decently under impossible conditions. Many shared food with children, treated wounded civilians, protected villagers, refused illegal orders, reported abuse, or carried memories not only of violence but of kindness and confusion. The history of Vietnam veterans is not one single accusation. It is a human record full of contradictions. But it is also true that the structure of the war exposed soldiers to moral danger as well as physical danger. When a military system rewards enemy kills, when the enemy often does not wear a uniform, when civilians may be suspected of aiding the enemy, when fear and grief build after friends are killed by mines or snipers, the possibility of cruelty expands. Not because every soldier wants cruelty, because the barriers against it erode under pressure. This erosion is one reason My Lai remains such a central wound in the American memory of Vietnam. On March 16th, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered the hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province, expecting to confront enemy forces, and instead killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The Army Historical Foundation summarizes the event by saying that First Lieutenant William Calley and his platoon murdered at least 300 Vietnamese civilians and perhaps as many as 500. My Lai was not the whole war, and it should not be used lazily to define every soldier who served. But it cannot be pushed aside either, because it revealed what could happen when fear, rage, poor leadership, dehumanization, pressure for results, and the blurred categories of guerrilla war collapsed into atrocity. It also revealed something else just as disturbing. At first, the killing was reported as a successful combat action. The gap between what happened on the ground and how it was initially described became part of the larger crisis of trust surrounding Vietnam. For soldiers who were not at My Lai, and who would never have done what was done there, the revelation still mattered. It entered the atmosphere of the war and the homecoming. It made civilians ask what American troops were doing. It made veterans feel accused, sometimes justly, sometimes unfairly, sometimes in ways that made them retreat further into silence. For those who had witnessed or participated in questionable acts elsewhere, it could awaken memories they had tried to bury. For those who had tried to behave honourably, it could deepen the bitterness of being grouped together with the worst moments of the war. Trauma does not always come from what a person personally did. Sometimes it comes from what he saw, what he failed to stop, what he feared he might have become, or what the world later assumed about him. There is a term people use now that helps explain part of this, though it was not the language most Vietnam veterans had at the time. Moral injury. It refers to the wound that can occur when a person does something, fails to prevent something, witnesses something, or is betrayed in a way that violates deeply held moral beliefs. Research on Vietnam veterans has found that involvement in wartime atrocities predicted later guilt, PTSD severity, hostility, aggression, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Again, the clinical language is tidy, but the human reality is not. A veteran may not say, "I have moral injury." He may say nothing. He may drink. He may avoid reunions. He may snap when someone calls him a hero because the word does not fit what he remembers. He may hate being called a murderer because that does not fit either. He may live for decades in the space between those two words, unable to accept praise, unable to survive condemnation, unable to explain the difference to people who want war to produce simple categories. The death of certainty did not happen only in the villages. It happened in command language too. Soldiers heard about progress while returning to the same areas again and again. They heard that an operation had been successful because the enemy had suffered losses, but then enemy forces appeared somewhere else. Official Army campaign summaries note that by the end of 1966, US military personnel in South Vietnam numbered 385,300, while enemy strength had also increased substantially, with large numbers of regular forces and political cadres. To a soldier on the ground, that could feel like shoveling water. You could sweep an area, destroy supplies, count dead, leave, and later hear that the enemy had returned. The question grew quietly in many minds. What are we actually accomplishing? That question is dangerous in war, not because soldiers cannot think, but because thinking too much about the larger purpose can make the immediate sacrifice harder to bear. The government spoke in strategic terms: stopping communism, supporting South Vietnam, protecting credibility, preventing dominoes from falling. These phrases mattered to policymakers, and some soldiers believed them deeply, others did not. Others moved between belief and doubt depending on the day. But when a soldier is in a village watching civilians cry over destroyed property, or carrying a wounded friend to a helicopter, or staring at a body he's told to count as enemy, large strategy can feel very far away. The body asks a simpler question. Why him? Why today? Why here? The official answer may be historically complex, but grief is not patient with complexity. There was another kind of uncertainty that came from the relationship between American troops and South Vietnamese allies. The United States was fighting in support of the Republic of Vietnam, but many American soldiers did not speak Vietnamese, did not understand local politics, and depended on interpreters, South Vietnamese soldiers, local officials and intelligence sources whose loyalties and accuracy could vary. Some South Vietnamese units fought with courage and skill. Some were mistrusted by Americans. Some local officials were corrupt. Some civilians feared the Viet Cong more than the government. Some supported the Viet Cong because they saw the Saigon government as distant, abusive, or illegitimate. None of this was easy for an American private to sort out while standing in the heat with a rifle. The war was not just us against them. It was many overlapping conflicts, and the soldier often encountered them only as danger. The inability to understand the language deepened the problem. Imagine entering homes, questioning families, searching belongings, giving commands, and receiving answers through gestures, fear, tone, or a third person's translation. A raised voice may sound guilty when it is only frightened. Silence may seem defiant when it is grief. A joke among villagers may be read as contempt. A child's stare may feel hostile simply because the soldier is already afraid. Human beings rely on language to soften uncertainty. Without it, they often fill the empty space with suspicion. Suspicion then becomes its own evidence. The more afraid a man is, the more threatening the unknown becomes. This is one of the reasons Vietnam could follow veterans home in relationships. War trained them to read ambiguity as danger. Civilian life is full of ambiguity. A spouse is quiet at breakfast. A teenager slams a door. A stranger looks too long across a parking lot. A neighbour asks a careless question. In ordinary life, these things can be irritating, sad, or meaningless. To a nervous system shaped by Vietnam, ambiguity itself may feel like threat. The body does not ask whether the situation is rationally safe. It reacts according to what it learned when uncertainty could kill. At the same time, uncertainty could turn inward. A soldier might begin to wonder about himself. Before Vietnam, he may have believed he was kind, brave, decent, ordinary. In Vietnam, he discovered capacities he did not know he had. The capacity to hate. The capacity to enjoy revenge for a moment. The capacity to feel nothing when something terrible happened because feeling would have slowed him down. The capacity to laugh after a death because the alternative was breaking. These discoveries can be frightening. People like to believe character is stable. War teaches that behaviour is shaped by conditions more than most civilians want to admit. A man can do things in one world that he would have condemned in another. That does not erase responsibility, but it complicates judgment. And the returning veteran often became his own harshest judge, because he knew the difference between the boy who left and the man who came back. Let us pause with that boy for a moment, not to excuse everything, not to condemn everything, but to understand the pressure. He is standing outside a hut while another soldier searches inside. Chickens scatter. A child is crying. An interpreter is asking questions. Someone has found rice. Maybe too much rice. Maybe not. Someone else has found a tunnel entrance nearby. The lieutenant is impatient. The unit took casualties 2 days ago. Nobody wants to be fooled. Nobody wants to be the man whose trust gets someone killed. A woman keeps saying something he cannot understand. An old man looks at the ground. In the distance, someone laughs. Or maybe it only sounds like laughter. The soldier's finger rests near the trigger because that is how he has survived. What is he looking at? A family? A supply point? A warning network? A trap? A village? A battlefield? The answer may be all of these or none, and he may have seconds to decide how to behave. That is the death of certainty. Not ignorance exactly. Ignorance is not knowing. This is worse. It is knowing enough to be afraid, but not enough to be sure. It is having power without clarity. It is being responsible without understanding. It is moving through a world where mistakes have permanent consequences, and then being expected to return home and fit back into a society that believes most choices are cleaner than they are. By the late 1960s, many American soldiers were living inside that uncertainty every day. The jungle had taught them not to rest. The villages taught them not to trust easily. Command language taught them that success could be counted without being felt. Civilian encounters taught them that innocence and danger could stand too close together. And the longer a man lived that way, the harder it became to imagine a world where a face was only a face, a road was only a road, and silence was only silence. The war had not merely frightened him, it had trained him in a different reality. And once that training entered the moral life of the soldier, the next wound was already beginning. Because fear alone is not the heaviest thing men brought home from Vietnam. Fear can fade in certain conditions. It can be soothed by safety, time, treatment, and love. But guilt is more stubborn. Shame is more stubborn. The memory of obeying an order, or watching an order carried out, or failing to ask a question at the moment when a question might have mattered, can stay in the mind with a different kind of weight. The invisible enemy made certainty die in the field, but what came after was the struggle to live with the things men were told to do, the things they did to survive, and the things many of them never found a way to speak aloud. The hardest things to carry home from Vietnam were not always the things that made noise. A helicopter landing under fire, a mortar round coming in at night, a mine lifting the earth under a man's boots. Those things had sound and impact and a place in memory that could be pointed to, at least in theory. A veteran could say, "That was the firefight," or "That was the ambush," or "That was the day we lost him," and even if the words were not enough, they had a shape. But there were other things that did not fit so cleanly into speech, orders that sounded normal when they were given because everyone around him was acting as if they were normal. Villages searched and emptied, houses burned because they might shelter the enemy, crops destroyed because they might feed the enemy, bodies counted because the war needed numbers, prisoners questioned because someone higher up wanted intelligence. A man might do what he was told, survive the day, and only much later, sitting at a kitchen table thousands of miles away, realise that obedience had not protected him from memory. This is one of the most painful misunderstandings about trauma in war. People imagine that the worst injury to the mind comes only from being helpless, from being attacked, from almost dying. Those things matter enormously. Fear can mark a person deeply, but Vietnam also created wounds from action, from participation, from the terrible knowledge that a soldier was not only someone to whom the war happened. Sometimes he was also someone through whom the war happened. That is a different burden. It is one thing to remember that someone tried to kill you. It is another thing to remember that you were told to destroy a home, or fire into a place you could not fully understand, or treat a frightened villager as a possible enemy, because the last man who trusted too easily did not make it back. And again, we have to be careful. Not every soldier committed atrocities. Not every order was unlawful. Not every hard decision was wrong. Many soldiers acted with restraint, compassion and discipline under conditions that would have broken civilians in a single day. But the structure of the war placed ordinary young men in situations where survival, obedience, fear, policy and morality could become tangled together until no one knew how to separate them cleanly. The American military in Vietnam fought for much of the war through a strategy of attrition, trying to wear down enemy forces faster than they could replace their losses. The US Army's own campaign summary says that American ground forces confined to South Vietnam fought a war of attrition and relied for a time on body counts as one standard indicator of progress. That sentence is simple, almost dry, but the human meaning inside it is enormous. It meant death became a measurement. It meant the war asked units to prove effectiveness by producing numbers, and those numbers travelled upward through reports and briefings until they became a way of saying that something had been accomplished. For the men on the ground, this could create a poisonous kind of pressure. If the enemy was invisible, if territory was not permanently held, if the same areas had to be swept again and again, then bodies became evidence. And when bodies become evidence, the moral atmosphere changes. Think about the young soldier again. He is not sitting in a policy meeting. He is not writing a strategy memo. He is tired, dirty, scared, and surrounded by other men whose lives depend partly on what he does next. He has been told there are Viet Cong in the area. Maybe there are. Maybe there were yesterday. Maybe they left through tunnels before the helicopters arrived. Maybe the villagers know where they went. Maybe the villagers know nothing. The operation begins, shots are fired, or perhaps shots are not fired, and afterwards someone needs to know how many enemy were killed. But what if a dead man has no weapon near him? What if the weapon is found somewhere else? What if a civilian was running? What if the village had been warned to leave and someone stayed behind because they were old, confused, stubborn, or afraid of abandoning their animals? The report asks for categories: enemy, civilian, suspect, detainee, killed, captured. The ground gives ambiguity. The soldier learns that ambiguity must be forced into a box before the day can be filed away. This was not only about paperwork, it shaped behaviour. When a unit had lost men to mines or snipers, anger did not remain abstract. It looked for a place to land. If a village was believed to have sheltered guerrillas, if a trail had been mined nearby, if a sniper had fired and vanished among civilians, then every hut, every rice cache, every male of fighting age, every silence could begin to look like part of the machinery that had killed Americans. The phrase, search and destroy, itself tells you something about the emotional structure of the war. Search first, because the enemy had to be found. Destroy second, because what supported the enemy had to be removed. But in a rural society, support could mean a bunker, a weapons cache, a bag of rice, a hidden tunnel, a family house, a crop, a water jar, a path, a person who knew too much, or a person suspected of knowing too much. The word destroy expanded easily. One of the clearest examples was Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, aimed at the Iron Triangle, an area northwest of Saigon long associated with Viet Cong activity. The official Army campaign summary describes American and South Vietnamese troops launching drives against Viet Cong strongholds there, capturing food supplies, destroying tunnel systems, and seizing documents. But the human story of the operation also involved the evacuation of civilians and the destruction of villages such as Ben Suk, which journalists at the time described in detail as homes were emptied, burned, bulldozed, and turned into part of a military solution. Now picture what that meant for the men carrying it out. A soldier may not have hated the people whose village was being destroyed. He may have felt sorry for them. He may have watched an old woman carrying a bundle, a child holding a chicken, a family trying to take what they could before the place they knew disappeared. He may have told himself because he was told that this was necessary. The enemy used the village. The tunnels ran under it. Supplies were hidden there. If the village remained, Americans would die. Maybe all of that felt true in the moment. Maybe some of it was true. But truth in war can still leave a stain. Years later, when that soldier remembered the faces of people watching their homes burn, the strategic explanation might not be enough to quiet the memory. The mind does not store a bulldozed house as policy. It stores it as an image. There is a particular kind of silence that grows around these memories. Men could talk about funny things. Funny. They could talk about bad food, bad weather, incompetent officers, music, fights, drinking, the absurdities of base life. They could talk about fear sometimes, especially with other veterans who already understood the shape of the thing. But telling a wife, a mother, or a child that you burned homes or watched homes burn, or called in fire on a place where people may still have been, is different. It requires the listener to hold you in a more complicated way. Many veterans feared that civilians could not do that. They feared being misunderstood, condemned, pitied, or asked questions that had no answer. So they said nothing. Or they told one story and left the centre out. The Vietnam War also asked soldiers to participate in a massive effort to change the landscape itself. Agent Orange and other tactical herbicides were sprayed to remove trees and dense tropical vegetation that provided enemy cover. The Department of Veterans Affairs describes Agent Orange as one of several tactical herbicides used by the US military in Vietnam, and notes that millions of gallons of Agent Orange and other herbicides were sprayed on trees and vegetation during the war. The VA also recognizes a range of diseases associated with exposure to these herbicides, including certain cancers and other conditions. At the time, for many of the men involved, spraying defoliants may have seemed like a technical solution. The jungle hid the enemy. Remove the cover, make ambush harder, make movement visible. It had the feel of modern war, scientific war solved from the air by chemicals, barrels, flight paths and maps. But later, the consequences became harder to contain. Veterans developed illnesses. Vietnamese civilians lived with contaminated land and health effects. Children were born into the aftermath. A man who once watched aircraft spray over jungle might later sit in a VA clinic, or hear about birth defects in Vietnam, or learn that what seemed like one more military tool had become a long shadow. That kind of delayed knowledge can be its own wound. It tells a veteran that the war was not finished even in the soil. There were other programs that operated in the grey space between military action, intelligence, policing, and political warfare. The Phoenix program, originally known as ICEX, was designed to target the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political and organisational network that supported the insurgency. A CIA paper preserved in the State Department's Foreign Relations series describes Phoenix as expanding through district centres across South Vietnam, with priorities that included defection, rallying, capture, and the destruction of infrastructure elements. It also refers to reward programs connected to capturing or killing Viet Cong cadre. That language again sounds administrative. Infrastructure elements, neutralization, cadre, intelligence, rewards. But on the ground, these words meant suspects, informants, interrogations, raids, arrests, disappearances, and fear. Some targets were real members of the Viet Cong apparatus. Some were dangerous people. Some were part of a system that used terror against Vietnamese civilians too. This matters, because the war was not a story of innocence on one side and guilt on the other. Viet Cong forces assassinated local officials, intimidated villagers, punished cooperation with the South Vietnamese government, and used civilians as support networks because revolutionary war does not remain neatly outside civilian life. But programs aimed at rooting out the hidden enemy also created room for abuse, false accusation, revenge, torture, and killing carried out under the cover of intelligence. A soldier or advisor who worked near that system might see things he didn't understand, or understood too well, and then later have no clean place to put them. This is part of what made Vietnam so psychologically corrosive. The war constantly translated human beings into categories that made action possible. A village became a hostile village. A zone became a free-fire zone. A man became military-age male. A prisoner became source. A dead body became enemy killed. A political organizer became infrastructure. A home became enemy shelter. A rice crop became enemy supply. The translation may have served military logic, but the human mind does not always accept the translation permanently. Later, the category can fall away and the person returns. The old man is no longer a possible informer. He is an old man. The hut is no longer suspected enemy shelter. It is someone's house. The child is no longer part of a dangerous environment. She is a child. And when that return happens in memory, it can be devastating. My Lai became the most infamous example of what could happen when the moral restraints of war collapsed. On March 16th, 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company entered the hamlet area of My Lai during an operation in Quang Ngai province. The Army Historical Foundation describes how hundreds of Vietnamese civilians, many of them women and children, were killed, and how the incident was initially covered up before former soldier Ronald Ridenour's letters helped trigger an investigation. Charges were later brought not only against men present at the massacre, but also against officers accused of failing to report or investigate what had happened. It is important to say again that My Lai was not the experience of every soldier in Vietnam. Most veterans were not at My Lai. Many were horrified when they learned what happened. Some resented being judged by an atrocity they did not commit. But My Lai still belongs in this story because it exposed the conditions under which certainty, restraint, leadership and humanity could fail catastrophically. It also exposed the silence afterward. Reports minimised or denied what had happened. Men who knew pieces of the truth carried them. Some tried to speak, others did not. The Army Historical Foundation notes that helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson reported what he saw, but his report did not lead to immediate higher-level action, and that senior commanders failed to properly investigate early reports that civilians had been killed. Think about the burden of seeing something wrong and not being able to stop it, or not stopping enough, or reporting it and watching the machinery absorb it without consequence. That too can traumatize a person. We often imagine guilt only as the guilt of the perpetrator, but there is also the guilt of the witness. The man who saw a prisoner mistreated and said nothing because he was afraid. The man who heard an order and obeyed because everyone else moved. The man who stood beside a burning house and looked away from the family that had lived there. The man who believed at the time that there was no choice and later wondered whether that belief had been a form of cowardice. These are not simple legal questions. They are moral memories, and moral memories do not always obey the same rules as courts. The phrase, following orders, has always had a dangerous double life. In a military unit, obedience can keep people alive. If every soldier debates every command in combat, chaos follows quickly. Discipline matters. Chain of command matters. Trust matters. But Vietnam put many soldiers in situations where obedience could later feel like complicity. A young private did not make the war. He did not design the strategy. He did not create the body count system, or the free fire zones, or the intelligence programs, or the political language that made villages into targets. Yet he was often the one who had to stand in the doorway, hold the rifle, light the match, pull the trigger, move the prisoner, count the body, or call in the coordinates. The distance between policymakers and action was filled by young men. This distance is one reason anger later became so common. Some veterans were angry at protesters, some were angry at officers, some were angry at politicians, some were angry at civilians who asked them whether they had killed anyone as if asking about the weather. Some were angry at themselves, and beneath that anger was often a terrible recognition. They had been placed in morally extreme conditions by people who would never have to dream their dreams. A president could change policy. A general could move units on a map. A briefing officer could report progress. But the soldier had to remember the crying child, the dead friend, the prisoner's face, the old woman beside the road, the smell of burned thatch, the silence after the shooting stopped. For many, alcohol became a way to push those memories down. So did work. So did distance. So did refusing to talk about Vietnam at all. A veteran might say, "I don't remember," when what he meant was, "I do not want to open the door." He might say, "We did what we had to do," because anything more precise would be unbearable. He might tell a joke. He might become angry at the question. He might leave the room. Families learned the borders of the silence. Do not ask about combat. Do not ask about nightmares. Do not wake him suddenly. Do not mention the war when he has been drinking. Do not say the wrong thing when the news shows footage of Vietnam. In this way, the things soldiers never spoke of still shaped the household. Silence is not absence. Sometimes silence is the loudest evidence that something remains. Research decades later gave some of this pain a name. Studies of Vietnam veterans have linked involvement in wartime atrocities or morally transgressive acts with guilt, more severe PTSD symptoms, hostility, depression, aggression, and suicidal thoughts. One study of moral transgression during the Vietnam War found that involvement in wartime atrocities predicted greater guilt and PTSD severity, among other outcomes. That finding is clinical, but it confirms something veterans had known in their bodies for years. The mind can be wounded not only by what is done to it, but by what it is made to do, what it witnesses, and what it cannot forgive itself for surviving. There is no honest way to tell this part of the story without discomfort. It would be easier to say that all American soldiers were victims of a bad war and leave it there. It would also be easier to say that all of them were guilty and leave it there. Both versions are false because both are too simple. Many were victims, some were perpetrators. Some were both in different moments. Some carried no particular guilt about their conduct, but suffered from fear and grief. Some behaved honourably and still felt contaminated by the war around them. Some committed cruel acts and buried them under decades of denial. Some told the truth and were not believed. Some never told the truth and were never asked by anyone brave enough to listen. That last point matters. Listening to veterans does not mean excusing everything. It does not mean turning away from Vietnamese suffering. In fact, any honest account of Vietnam must keep Vietnamese civilians at the centre too, because they bore the war in their homes, fields, bodies and families. But listening does mean refusing to treat the American soldier as a cardboard figure. He was not simply a hero statue or a villain in a protest poster. He was often a young man placed inside a war where the line between necessary force and moral damage could become dangerously thin, and where even lawful actions could leave lasting emotional marks because the human mind is not built like a legal manual. So imagine him years later. He's home. He has a job. Maybe he has a wife, children, a mortgage, a car that needs repair. To the neighbours, he's quiet. Maybe a little hard to know. Maybe he works too much. Maybe he drinks too much. Maybe he startles too easily. Maybe he never mentions Vietnam except in short fragments that stop before they reach the centre. But inside him there are rooms he does not enter. In one room, a village is being searched. In another, a prisoner is sitting in the heat. In another, a helicopter is lifting off and leaving dust behind. In another, someone is counting bodies. In another, a family is walking away from a home that will not be there by evening. He does not visit these rooms willingly. At night they visit him, and this is how the war began to move from battlefield to household. The things men were ordered to do, the things they did because they were afraid, the things they watched, the things they could not prevent, and the things they never found words for did not disappear when the tour ended. They crossed the ocean quietly. They came back folded inside duffel bags, inside letters never sent, inside jokes that sounded too sharp, inside medals kept in drawers, inside photographs no one was allowed to ask about. The country waiting for them did not know how to receive that kind of burden. Some people wanted to honour them without hearing the truth. Some wanted to condemn the war and forgot that the men who fought it had also been damaged by it. Some wanted the whole subject to be over, but the men were coming home now, and home was about to become another battlefield, not with rifles and mines, but with silence, memory, shame, and a nation that often looked away. Coming home from Vietnam should have been simple. That's the first illusion we have to let go of. A man survived the flight in, the heat, the patrols, the mines, the villages, the nights when the jungle seemed to listen back, and then one day his number of days left finally reached 0. He packed what little he could keep, handed over what belonged to the unit, maybe said goodbye badly because men in war often do not know how to say goodbye without making the leaving hurt more, and then he moved through the military system in reverse, out of the field, out of the unit, out of Vietnam, onto a plane, across the Pacific, back toward a country that had continued without him. You would think that return would feel like rescue. You would think the body would understand immediately that the danger had passed. You would think the first breath of American air would tell the mind, it is finished now. But for many Vietnam veterans, that is not how it worked. The return was too fast, too lonely, too unsupported, and too strange. A man could be in a combat zone and then, within a matter of days, find himself walking through an airport where nobody knew his name, nobody knew what he had seen, and nobody seemed to understand that he was carrying a year of war inside a duffel bag that looked almost ordinary. The last US combat troops left South Vietnam on March 29th. 1973, 2 months after the Paris Peace Agreement, and prisoners of war were released in the same period, marking the end of America's direct ground combat role. But that date did not end the war inside the men who had fought it. The military could move a soldier across the world quickly. It could not move him back into civilian life with the same efficiency. That was the part no one had built a proper system for. During World War II, many American soldiers returned by ship, spending days or weeks with other men who had been through the same war, men who could talk, or not talk, in the company of those who understood. Vietnam often gave returning soldiers no such slow passage. The individual rotation system meant that men came home one by one or in small groups, according to the end of their own tours, not as part of a whole unit returning together to a national celebration. They did not march down Main Street with the men they had fought beside. They did not return as a victorious army after a clear surrender. They returned as individuals from an unpopular, unresolved war, and that loneliness mattered more than people realized at the time. A soldier might leave behind the only people who understood him, then land among civilians who knew Vietnam mostly through television images, political arguments, casualty reports, protest signs, and official statements that had long since lost credibility for much of the public. There was often no bridge between those worlds. There was only the veteran standing in the middle, expected to cross by himself. Picture him at the airport. Not every veteran was spat on or insulted, and historians have debated how common those stories truly were. Some men were met with love. Some were met by parents who cried with relief, wives who had counted the months, children who barely remembered them, friends who wanted to buy them a drink. But the larger public atmosphere was still one of discomfort. Vietnam had become the war people argued about at dinner tables, on campuses, on the news, in churches, in Congress, in the streets. The returning soldier could feel that argument attach itself to his uniform. Some people saw him as a victim of bad policy. Some saw him as a symbol of that policy. Some thanked him quietly. Some avoided looking at him. Some asked stupid questions. Some asked cruel ones. Some did not ask anything at all. That last response, the silence, may have been the most common, and in some ways the most damaging. Americans did not know what to do with these men. So many did nothing. A country can look away without turning its head. It can look away by changing the subject, by saying you are home now, by treating employment and marriage and fatherhood as proof that the past has been solved, by praising service in public while refusing to hear what service actually contained. For the veteran, this could feel like a second abandonment. First, the war had placed him in danger. Then home refused to make room for the truth of what danger had done. Think about the shock of normal life. In Vietnam, a man learned to measure safety by terrain, sound, movement, and instinct. At home, safety was assumed. People stood too close in lines, cars backfired, fireworks exploded for fun. Children ran up behind him without warning. A waitress dropped a tray and everyone laughed. A door slammed in the wind. The telephone rang in the middle of the night. A helicopter passed overhead. To everyone else, these were ordinary sounds. To him, some of them arrived as commands from the past. His body reacted before his mind could explain. He might duck, freeze, curse, swing, leave the room, or sit very still until his hands stopped shaking. Then came the embarrassment, the family staring, the apology, the lie that he was fine, the anger at himself for not being fine. This is what people around him often misunderstood. The veteran was not choosing to remain at war. His nervous system had been trained by a year of conditions in which sudden sound could mean death. That training did not disappear because the living room had curtains and a television set. It remained under the skin, ready. Families often became the first witnesses to this invisible return. A wife might expect the man she loved to be different for a few weeks, maybe quiet, maybe tired, maybe a little distant, and then she waited for him to become himself again. But what if the self she remembered had been altered too deeply? What if he could not sleep in bed because sleep made him vulnerable? What if he preferred the couch, the floor, the garage, anywhere that let him feel closer to escape? What if he drank because alcohol gave him a few hours when the images blurred? What if he seemed bored by ordinary affection, not because he did not love his family, but because part of him had shut down feeling in order to survive? What if he erupted over a small inconvenience because in his body the feeling was not small? Children learn these patterns quickly. They learned whether to wake their father gently or not at all. They learned what subjects changed the air in the room. They learned that a man could be present at the dinner table and still be somewhere else. Some children of Vietnam veterans grew up with a war they never saw shaping the house they lived in. The war entered through mood, silence, alcohol, nightmares, sudden rage, and the terrible tenderness of a father who loved them but could not always reach them from wherever memory had taken him. Employers did not always understand either. A veteran came home needing work, and work could be stabilizing. It gave structure, money, a reason to get up, a place to put the body during daylight. But civilian employment required forms of patience that war had damaged in many men. A foreman's criticism could sound like disrespect. Office noise could become unbearable. Crowds could feel unsafe. Authority could trigger anger, especially in men who felt used by the authorities who had sent them to Vietnam. Some veterans moved from job to job, not because they were lazy, but because ordinary workplaces were built for ordinary nervous systems. Others worked constantly, using exhaustion as a sedative. They became the men who never stopped moving, who volunteered for overtime, who repaired the roof at dusk, who could not sit quietly because stillness gave memory too much room. From the outside, this could look like discipline. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was flight. The culture of the time gave them few acceptable ways to explain the difference. The medical language was not ready for them. That is one of the most important facts in this story. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not enter the official psychiatric manual until 1980, 5 years after the end of the Vietnam War, and Vietnam veterans were the first group to have that term widely applied to them. Before that, a man might be called unstable, angry, alcoholic, depressed, poorly adjusted, violent, immature, weak, or simply difficult. He might be treated for separate symptoms without anyone naming the larger pattern. Nightmares were one problem. Drinking was another. Marriage conflict was another. Trouble holding a job was another. Anxiety was another. Rage was another. The diagnosis that could connect them had not yet become part of common medical or public vocabulary. So veterans often suffered in fragments. Their lives showed the pattern before the culture had a name for it. This delay mattered because naming a wound is not a small thing. A name does not heal by itself, but it tells a person that his suffering is not random, not private failure, not proof that he alone is broken. Without a name, shame fills the empty space. Many veterans believed they should simply be tougher. After all, other men had gone to war. Their fathers had survived World War II. Their grandfathers had survived the Depression, maybe the First World War. Men were supposed to endure. So if they could not sleep, if they felt detached, if they startled at sounds, if they avoided crowds, if they could not stop thinking about dead friends, they often blamed themselves. The country helped them do it by offering too little understanding and too much judgment. There was another cruelty in the timing. When Vietnam veterans came home in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the nation itself was exhausted by the war. The Tet Offensive, the assassinations of 1968, the protests, the draft resistance, the My Lai revelations, the Pentagon Papers, the long televised argument about whether leaders had misled the public. All of it created a mood in which many Americans wanted Vietnam to end not only as a military conflict, but as a subject. They wanted the news to move on. They wanted their sons home, but they did not necessarily want to know what those sons had done or endured. They wanted to oppose the war without always knowing how to receive the warrior. They wanted to support the troops without asking whether the troops had been morally injured by the mission itself. They wanted the dead honoured, the wounded treated, the politics settled, and the living veterans to fold themselves back into the country without making the country look too closely at what had been asked of them. That is what looking away meant. It was not always hatred. Often it was fatigue, fear, guilt, confusion, and the strong human desire not to hear anything that would make normal life harder to enjoy. Some veterans refused that silence. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, founded in 1967, became one of the most visible examples of returning soldiers speaking publicly against the conflict. In 1971, veterans connected to the group held the Winter Soldier investigation in Detroit, where former service members testified about what they said they had seen and done in Vietnam. The organisation described the purpose of the hearings not as a trial, but as an effort to prevent continued brutality and expose the realities of the war. Whatever one thinks of every claim made there, the significance is clear. Some veterans were trying to force the country to listen to the moral cost of the war, not through politicians or reporters, but through the voices of men who had been there. This was not comfortable for the public, and it was not comfortable for veterans who disagreed with them. It created divisions within the veteran community itself. Some men felt betrayed by anti-war veterans. Some felt represented by them for the first time. Some wanted to speak but could not bear the exposure. Some wanted the war condemned but their service respected. Some wanted no part of any movement, pro-war or anti-war, because they had already given enough of themselves to other people's causes. Homecoming support, or the lack of it, was not just a sentimental matter. Later research found that negative or unsupported homecoming experiences were associated with worse mental health outcomes among veterans, including PTSD, depression, and other post-deployment problems. That makes sense if you think about trauma as something that needs witnesses. A person can survive terror, but afterward the mind looks for confirmation that what happened was real, that the suffering matters, that the person is still connected to a community. If the community responds with rejection, suspicion, indifference, or silence, the wound does not remain only in the past. It becomes part of the present. The veteran learns not only that Vietnam was dangerous, but that home is not fully safe either. Not physically unsafe in the same way, but emotionally unsafe. Unsafe for truth. Unsafe for grief. Unsafe for the parts of him that do not fit the story people want to hear. This is why some veterans found more comfort with each other than with anyone else. In veterans' bars, motorcycles clubs, informal gatherings, therapy groups, and later veterans' centres, they could speak in shorthand. A look could replace a paragraph. A joke could carry more grief than a civilian would recognise. They did not have to explain what incoming sounded like, or why certain smells mattered, or why a man might sit with his back to a wall. The problem was that not every veteran found such a community, and even when they did, comradeship could heal some wounds while reinforcing others. Men could drink together instead of grieve together. They could repeat stories without entering the feelings beneath them. They could protect one another from civilian misunderstanding, while also protecting one another from the vulnerability that treatment might require. Still, for many, other veterans were the first people who made home feel even slightly less foreign. The government response was slow and uneven. The Veterans Administration existed, of course, and many veterans received medical care, education benefits, home loans, and other forms of assistance. But the specific psychological needs of Vietnam veterans were not fully understood at the moment they were returning. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, completed in the late 1980s, was created to provide accurate information about post-war psychological problems and the adjustment of Vietnam veterans, including PTSD and related difficulties. Think about that timeline. Large numbers of men came home in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The major national study designed to measure the problem came more than a decade later. By then, marriages had already failed, jobs had already been lost, addictions had already deepened, children had already grown up learning the shape of their father's pain. Some veterans had already died by suicide, accident, illness, exposure, or slow self-destruction. The research mattered. It came too late for many. Agent Orange added another layer to the feeling that the country had looked away. During the war, American forces sprayed millions of gallons of herbicides, including Agent Orange, to remove vegetation and deny enemy cover. Years later, veterans fought for recognition that exposure was connected to serious health problems, and the Department of Veterans Affairs now recognizes multiple diseases associated with Agent Orange exposure. For a veteran already struggling with memory and readjustment, illness could feel like proof that Vietnam had entered the body in a literal way. It was not only in dreams, it was in skin, lungs, nerves, blood, cancers, and children's fears about what their father might pass on or die from. The delayed recognition of Agent Orange conditions also repeated a pattern veterans already knew too well. First, the country asks you to serve. Then it doubts what service did to you. Then it demands proof. Then, sometimes after years of advocacy, it admits what should have been faced earlier. That kind of delay can turn pain into bitterness. Public memory also arrived late. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in November 1982, a simple black granite wall engraved with the names of those who died or remained missing, arranged by date of casualty rather than rank. The memorial did something the country had failed to do well for years. It gave people a place to go. It did not explain the war. It did not justify it. It did not argue policy. It did not shout. It simply placed the names where they could not be avoided. Veterans came and touched the stone. Families traced names onto paper. People left boots, letters, medals, photographs, cigarettes, wedding rings, poems, dog tags, and things no official ceremony could have anticipated. The wall became a kind of public witness. But notice the date, 1982. For many veterans, more than a decade had passed since coming home. A place of mourning arrived after years in which mourning had been politically tangled, socially uncomfortable, and privately unfinished. The wall helped, but it could not give back the lost years. It could not undo the airport loneliness, the dinner table silence, the jobs lost, the marriages strained beyond repair, the nights spent drinking because sleep had become dangerous. There is something deeply American about the delay. The country often builds monuments after it has failed to listen to the living. Stone becomes possible before conversation does. Names become honoured before stories become bearable. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is powerful precisely because it refuses easy language, but the men who returned needed more than stone. They needed doctors who understood trauma, families who knew how to listen without demanding immediate healing, employers who recognized readjustment as more than discipline, and a public willing to separate the moral failure of policy from the humanity of the people who carried it out. Some received pieces of that support, many did not, and so they improvised survival. Some became activists, some became counsellors for younger veterans, some built quiet lives and never spoke much. Some vanished into homelessness, some entered prisons, some entered churches, some found meaning in veterans' organisations, some spent decades trying to prove they were normal, some spent decades trying to prove they had been wounded in a way no one could see, some did both at once. What makes this homecoming so central to the trauma of Vietnam is that it turned private injury into social isolation. Combat had trained the soldier to distrust the world. Homecoming often confirmed the lesson. If he spoke honestly, people recoiled. If he stayed silent, people assumed he was fine. If he asked for help, the help might not know what it was looking at. If he expressed anger, he became a problem. If he expressed grief, he risked shame. If he said the war was wrong, some called him disloyal. If he defended his service, others heard him defending the war. There was no easy language available. The veteran had to live inside contradictions that the country itself could not resolve. He could be proud of his unit and ashamed of the war. He could love the men he served with and hate the mission. He could miss Vietnam and be horrified by that fact. He could feel lucky to be alive and guilty for surviving. He could want to be thanked and feel disgusted when someone thanked him without understanding. He could want to forget and still feel that forgetting would betray the dead. These contradictions are not signs of confusion. They are the honest structure of the experience. A country that looked away made those contradictions heavier because it left men to carry them alone. So imagine him again, not stepping off the plane now, but a few months later. The uniform is gone from daily life. Maybe it hangs in a closet or lies folded in a trunk. His hair has grown out. He has found work or is looking for it. Someone has told him he should move on. Someone else has asked whether he ever killed anybody. His mother watches him at dinner and knows not to ask why he keeps looking toward the window. His wife wakes to him shouting in his sleep. His child learns that a sudden noise can change the whole house. On television, people argue about the war as if it is an idea. For him, it is not an idea. It is weather inside the body. It comes and goes. Some days are clear, some nights bring it back. The country has mostly turned toward other concerns by now, but he cannot turn so easily. He brought Vietnam home because there was nowhere else to put it. And before doctors had the right name, before the public had the patience, before the memorial gave grief a physical address, these men lived through years when the symptoms were already there, moving through marriages, jobs, streets, bars, hospitals and bedrooms, waiting for a language that had not yet arrived. The nightmares had begun. The silence had settled in. The wound was real, but the country had not yet agreed on what to call it. The nightmares had begun long before anyone had a proper name for them. They were not always dramatic in the way movies later tried to show them. Not every man woke up screaming. Some did, and their families remembered it for the rest of their lives. The sudden shout in the dark, the body thrashing against sheets, the wife reaching over and learning very quickly that touching him too fast could be dangerous. But other nightmares were quieter. A man might wake with his eyes open, and no sound coming out of him at all. He might sit on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, looking at the floor, unable to explain why the room felt wrong. He might get up and check the locks, then check them again, then stand at the window listening to the street as if the neighbourhood itself had become a perimeter. He might not remember the dream clearly, only the feeling of it, the pressure in the chest, the certainty that something terrible had just happened or was about to happen. And sometimes the dream did not come at night. Sometimes it arrived in daylight, in a grocery store, in a factory, in a car stopped at a traffic light, when a smell, sound, face, patch of tree line or sudden movement pulled the mind backward before the man had time to resist. This is one of the first things to understand about the years after Vietnam. The war did not stay politely in memory. It interrupted. A memory is supposed to be something a person can summon or set aside. Traumatic memory often behaves differently. It arrives without permission. A veteran might be standing in his driveway in 1974 or 1978 or 1982, holding a trash bag or a set of keys, and suddenly he is not fully in the driveway anymore. He's back in wet heat, back near a trail, back hearing rotors, back smelling burning vegetation, back watching a friend carried away, back in a village where the crying will not stop. The body reacts as if time has folded, heart racing, muscles tight, hands cold, breathing shallow. The mind knows maybe that the war is over. The body is not convinced. That mismatch is exhausting. It makes a man distrust himself because he cannot always predict when his own mind will betray him. Today, many people would recognise pieces of this as post-traumatic stress. The Department of Veterans Affairs describes PTSD as something that can develop after a life-threatening or traumatic event, especially when symptoms such as reliving the event, avoidance, negative changes in mood, and feeling keyed up or on guard continue for more than a few months. But most returning Vietnam veterans did not come home to that vocabulary. The American Psychiatric Association did not add post-traumatic stress disorder to the DSM-3 until 1980, and the VA's own history of PTSD notes that this recognition drew heavily on research and advocacy involving returning Vietnam War veterans, Holocaust survivors, sexual trauma victims, and others. ptsd.va.gov. That means there was a long stretch of time when thousands of men were already living with symptoms that would later become recognisable, while the official language needed to connect those symptoms had not yet reached them. So what did people call it before then? They called it nerves. They called it drinking too much. They called it a bad temper. They called it not adjusting. They called it being hard to live with. They called it marriage trouble, job trouble, police trouble, sleep trouble, attitude trouble. They called it everything around the wound except the wound itself. A wife might say her husband was different since he came home. A mother might say her son did not laugh the way he used to. A boss might say the veteran was unreliable or angry. A doctor might treat insomnia, headaches, stomach problems, depression or alcoholism without seeing the war threaded through all of it. The symptoms were divided into separate boxes because nobody had yet given the pattern a strong enough name. And without a name, each man could believe he was failing privately at something other men had somehow managed. There is something very lonely about suffering before language has caught up to you. You can feel the thing happening inside your own body, but when you try to describe it, the words available are too small. A veteran might say, "I can't sleep," because saying "I am afraid to sleep because sleep gives the war access to me" sounds strange even to himself. He might say, "I don't like crowds," because saying crowds make me scan for exits, threats, hands, bags, sudden movement, and the shortest route to safety would make people stare. He might say, "Leave me alone," because saying, "I do not know how to be close to you without feeling exposed" is not a sentence most men of that generation were trained to speak. The silence was not always stubbornness. Sometimes it was translation failure. He could not turn the inner experience into words that civilian life knew how to receive. The nightmares themselves carried many forms. Some men dreamed directly of combat, the same event repeating with small changes, the same friend dying again, the same ambush unfolding, the same helicopter failing to arrive in time. Others dreamed in fragments: mud, blood, a child's face, a door, a field, a sound without a visible source. The mind does not always replay trauma like a film. It may keep only pieces, and the pieces can be worse because they do not explain themselves. A man wakes from an image of tall grass and feels terror before he remembers why tall grass matters. He smells diesel and feels sick. He hears rain and feels the weight of wet gear. He sees fireworks and hears artillery. He cannot convince his body that July in America is not Vietnam. The calendar says one thing, the nervous system says another. And then there was avoidance, which often looked to families like coldness. A man who avoided talking about Vietnam might seem secretive. A man who avoided reunions might seem antisocial. A man who avoided watching the news might seem indifferent to the world. A man who avoided church, crowds, hunting trips, family celebrations or long drives might be called difficult. But avoidance is often the mind's attempt to survive its own triggers. If speaking brings images, do not speak. If crowds bring danger, avoid crowds. If certain smells bring nausea, stay away from them. If children playing with toy guns bring back real guns, leave the room. If love makes loss possible, keep love at a distance. This can preserve a person in the short term while slowly shrinking his life. The home becomes smaller, the relationships become thinner, the acceptable subjects narrow. The family learns to walk around the sealed room in the centre of the house. Numbing may have been even harder for families to understand. Fear is visible. Rage is visible. Drinking is visible. Numbness can pass for calm. A veteran might sit through a birthday party, a graduation, a family dinner, a Christmas morning, and feel almost nothing. He sees his child opening presents and knows this should move him. He watches his wife laugh and knows he should feel warmth. He hears good news and produces the correct response a second late, like a man reading instructions. This does not mean he does not love them. It may mean feeling itself has become dangerous territory. In Vietnam, feeling too much could make a man hesitate, and hesitation could get someone killed. So the mind learned to close doors. Back home, the doors stayed closed. The family stood outside knocking, and the veteran, trapped on the other side, may not have known how to open them without letting everything else out too. Anger often took the place of the feelings that could not be reached. Anger had energy. Anger felt safer than grief. Anger did not ask a man to admit helplessness. It moved outward. A small frustration could ignite something disproportionate because it was not really about the small frustration. The broken appliance, the traffic jam, the disrespectful teenager, the bill in the mail, the dropped dish, the neighbour's dog barking, all of it could become the surface where deeper pressure broke through. Families sometimes remember Vietnam veterans as men with sudden tempers, men whose houses could become quiet in an instant when their mood shifted. But inside that anger there was often fear, shame, grief, exhaustion, and the humiliation of not understanding why civilian life felt so hard after surviving something so much harder. A man may have thought, I lived through Vietnam. Why can't I live through a normal Tuesday? Alcohol was one of the most common answers, because alcohol did not ask questions. It helped with sleep until it ruined sleep. It softened memory until memory came back harder. It made a man talk, or made him stop talking. It gave him a reason for behaviour he could not explain otherwise. If he woke ashamed, he could blame the bottle rather than the war. Drugs also played a role for some veterans, both during and after service, though experiences varied widely. What matters here is not reducing all Vietnam veterans to addiction, because that would be false and unfair. Many did not become addicted. Many built stable lives. Many fought hard for sobriety. But for those who did use substances to manage symptoms, the substance often became a crude form of self-treatment in a society that had not yet offered a better one. The veteran was not necessarily trying to destroy himself. He was trying to get through the night. The silence around suicide was even deeper. Families might know a man was troubled. They might know he drank, isolated, raged, or spoke about not wanting to go on. But suicide carried shame, and veteran suicide carried the added confusion of delayed casualty. If a man died years after coming home, was he counted as a casualty of the war? Officially no. His name did not go on the casualty list from the battlefield, but to the people who knew him, the line could feel less clear. The bullet, overdose, car crash, or slow self-destruction might occur in America, but the pressure behind it may have begun in Vietnam. This is one of the hardest parts of war to count. Nations count the dead more easily than the haunted. They count bodies more easily than decades. Some veterans found their way into early spaces where the silence could break. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, informal veteran discussion groups, often called rap groups, became places where Vietnam veterans could speak to one another about combat, guilt, rage, alienation, and homecoming. Psychiatrists such as Robert J. Lifton and Khaim Shatan became closely associated with these efforts, and historians of trauma have described these groups as part of the path that eventually led to PTSD being included in DSM-3 in 1980, clearpsyche.org. Think about that image. Men who'd been trained not to confess fear sitting in rooms with other men who knew the same smell, the same vocabulary, the same shame, and slowly discovering that the private madness might not be private. Someone else could not sleep. Someone else could not stop seeing faces. Someone else felt guilty for surviving. Someone else hated being thanked. Someone else loved his brothers from the war and hated the war itself. That recognition could be powerful enough to keep a man alive. The term post-Vietnam syndrome began circulating before PTSD became official. It was an imperfect term, but it mattered because it suggested that the problem was not simply weakness or bad character. It said there was a pattern specific enough to name. It also tied the symptoms to the war and to the homecoming. not only to the individual. That was a major shift. If the syndrome was post-Vietnam, then Vietnam had not ended at the edge of the battlefield. It had entered American bedrooms, marriages, clinics, jails, workplaces and streets. It had become a public problem disguised as private breakdown. This was one reason some people resisted the idea. Naming trauma can be politically uncomfortable because it points backward. It asks who sent these men, what was done to them, what they were asked to do, and why help arrived so late. When PTSD entered the DSM-3 in 1980, it did something that earlier labels had not fully done. It recognised that an outside event could produce a lasting psychological injury. That may sound obvious now, but it was not always obvious in psychiatric language. Earlier terms like shell shock, combat fatigue, war neurosis, and gross stress reaction had appeared in different contexts, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with suspicion, and sometimes with the implication that symptoms would fade once the person left the battlefield. The VA history of PTSD notes that reactions to war trauma had been described across earlier conflicts under names such as soldier's heart, shell shock, and battle fatigue. But the 1980 diagnosis marked a new formal recognition of a trauma-related condition. PTSD.va.gov. For Vietnam veterans, this was not merely medical history. It was a kind of delayed validation. It said, in official language, that the war could still be acting on them years later. Validation did not mean instant healing. A diagnosis can open doors, but a man still has to walk through them, and many did not. Some distrusted the VA. Some had been dismissed too many times. Some did not want to be labelled. Some feared that accepting the diagnosis meant admitting damage, and damage felt too close to weakness. Some had built entire lives around not knowing what they knew. Others sought help and found treatment uneven, especially in the early years. Therapists and doctors were learning too. The country was learning too. Families were learning after years of improvising around symptoms without a map. The name arrived, but it arrived into lives already shaped by silence. The scale of the problem became clearer as studies followed. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, conducted in the 1980s, became one of the major efforts to measure psychological effects among Vietnam-era veterans. Published analyses estimated that lifetime PTSD affected about 30.9% of male Vietnam theatre veterans and 26.9% of female theatre veterans, with partial PTSD affecting many more, though later studies and reanalyses debated exact rates. link.springer.com. The debate over numbers matters to researchers, but the script of daily life had already been written in thousands of homes. Whether a statistic was revised upward or downward, the lived reality remained. Large numbers of Vietnam veterans experienced persistent symptoms that shaped their health, relationships, work, and sense of self long after the war. There is something almost unbearable about the delay between suffering and recognition. A man comes home in 1969. He cannot sleep. He drinks. His marriage strains. He loses a job. He frightens his children. He avoids old friends. He goes to a doctor and receives pills for nerves, or advice to relax, or nothing useful. He hears people argue about whether the war was noble or shameful, but almost no one asks what it is like to still be there at night. 11 years pass before PTSD becomes official. More years pass before public understanding catches up even slightly. By then his children are older. His wife may have left. His body may be sick from stress, alcohol, injury or exposure. His habits are no longer temporary responses. They are part of the architecture of his life. Recognition helps, but it cannot return the years when he thought he was simply broken. And yet, many veterans did survive those years with a toughness that deserves careful respect. Not the shallow kind that praises silence, but the deeper kind that recognises the work of staying alive. Some entered therapy and did the difficult labour of speaking. Some joined veterans groups. Some made art, wrote memoirs, testified, counselled other veterans, returned to Vietnam, searched for reconciliation, or built small routines that made life manageable. Some became gentle fathers after years of not knowing how. Some apologised. Some never apologised but changed. Some carried their symptoms to the end of life and still showed up for their families in the ways they could. Trauma did not erase their agency. It complicated it. They were not only wounded men, they were men living with wounds while trying, with varying success, to be husbands, fathers, workers, friends, citizens, and sometimes simply decent people in the hours between memories. The families carried their own version of the unnamed thing. A wife might not have a diagnosis either, but she knew the patterns. She knew when his sleep had changed. She knew when a smell had caught him. She knew when a reunion letter in the mail had made him quiet for 3 days. Children became experts in atmosphere. They could tell from the sound of a truck in the driveway whether the evening would be safe. They knew which jokes not to make. They knew not to sneak up behind him. Some grew angry at the father who could not be fully present. Some protected him. Some feared him. Some loved him with a loyalty made more complicated by confusion. The war reached them indirectly, and for that reason their pain was harder to explain. They had not been to Vietnam, but Vietnam had been in the house. This is why the name mattered beyond the veterans themselves. PTSD gave families a way to see patterns that had once looked personal. The father was not simply distant. The husband was not simply cruel. The son was not simply strange. Naming didn't excuse harm done inside families. It did not erase responsibility. But it added context, and context can change grief. A child who grows up thinking, "My father did not love me enough to be present," may later learn, "My father loved me through an injury no one around him understood." That does not fix childhood. It does not make the shouting disappear, but it can loosen the grip of one kind of pain and replace it with another, sadder, more complicated, and sometimes more forgiving. By the time the country had a name, the veterans had already given it evidence. Their nightmares were evidence. Their silence was evidence. Their failed marriages, hospital records, drinking patterns, rap groups, testimonies, and impossible returns were evidence. Their bodies had been making the argument before the manuals did. The diagnosis did not create the wound. It recognized it. That distinction matters because people sometimes speak as if PTSD appeared in 1980. It did not. What appeared in 1980 was the official willingness to name a pattern that had been living in human beings for years and in soldiers from earlier wars for generations before that. Vietnam forced the issue because too many men came home, too visibly changed for the country to keep calling it nerves. So return once more to the quiet house at night. The veteran is asleep, or trying to be. His family is asleep around him. Outside, America is not at war in the way it was when he left, but the war has not vanished. It waits in the body. It waits in the dream. It waits in the sound of rain against the window, in the sudden crack of a car exhaust, in the smell of damp earth through an open door. He wakes before dawn. For a moment he does not know where he is. Then the bedroom returns, the wall, the dresser, the sleeping shape beside him, the dark ceiling. He is home. He knows he is home. Still his heart is racing as if knowledge alone is not enough. He sits there in the dark, not wanting to wake anyone, not wanting to explain, not wanting to go back to sleep, not knowing that men across the country are sitting in similar rooms with similar fear. The name has not reached him yet. The country has not reached him yet. But the pattern is there, steady and terrible, waiting to be recognised. And once that recognition finally began, it changed more than the lives of Vietnam veterans. It changed how later generations would understand war itself. It made room for the possibility that courage and injury could exist in the same person. It challenged the old lie that a man who came home physically intact had come home whole. It forced doctors, families, historians and soldiers to look at the long afterlife of combat. But recognition also raised a final question, one that does not let the country off easily. If Vietnam stayed inside these men for decades, then what exactly did they carry? Not just fear, not just memories, not just guilt, but a whole war stored in bodies that aged, worked, loved, broke, healed and endured. The generation that carried Vietnam did not carry it as an idea. They carried it in their sleep, their tempers, their illnesses, their silences, their loyalty to the dead, and in the uneasy knowledge that coming home is not always the same as leaving the war behind. By the time many Vietnam veterans reached middle age, the war had changed form. It was no longer a place they could point to on a map or a period of service written in old military records. It had become part of how they slept, how they reacted, how they trusted people, how they sat in restaurants, how they raised children, how they avoided certain roads, certain smells, certain conversations, certain parts of themselves. The war had moved into the body. That may sound strange at first because we are used to thinking of memory as something stored in the mind, as if the past sits somewhere behind the eyes like a film reel that can be played or put away. But for many veterans, Vietnam was not stored neatly. It lived in the muscles, in the stomach, in the heart rate, in the startle response, in the hands tightening around a steering wheel when a helicopter crossed the sky, in the sudden anger that arrived before thought, in the years of sleep broken by dreams that were not only dreams. The body had learned Vietnam as a survival lesson, and the body did not forget simply because America wanted to move on. This is one of the reasons the long afterlife of the war matters so much. The Vietnam War did not end for American soldiers in one shared moment. It ended in pieces. For one man, it ended when his plane lifted off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. For another, when he stepped through his parents' front door and saw that his bedroom was still there. For another, when he threw his uniform into a closet and did not open that closet for years. For another, it didn't end at all in any ordinary sense. It became quieter, maybe. It became less visible to others. It lost the sound of actual gunfire and gained the sound of a refrigerator humming at 3 a.m. while he sat awake in the kitchen. It stopped being a war fought by units and became a war fought privately by men trying to get through the next hour without drinking, without shouting, without remembering too much, without letting their families see how far away they still were. The country eventually began to understand that many Vietnam veterans were carrying something real, not weakness, not a failure of character, not simple nostalgia or bitterness, a wound. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, requested by Congress in 1983, was the first major national study to examine PTSD and other post-war psychological problems among Vietnam veterans, and it brought wide attention to the fact that as many as 15% of veterans had PTSD at the time of the study. Later, the National Vietnam Veterans Longitudinal Study followed up decades after the war, and a major 2015 analysis in JAMA Psychiatry estimated that about 271,000 Vietnam theatre veterans still had current full or sub-threshold war zone PTSD more than 40 years after the war, with many also experiencing major depression. Read that slowly, because it is one of those facts that should stop the room for a moment. 40 years later, men who had become grandfathers, men whose hair had gone grey, men who had retired from jobs, buried parents, watched children grow up, paid mortgages, gone to church, attended school plays, fixed cars, planted gardens, and still, somewhere inside all of that ordinary life, Vietnam remained active. That is what it means to carry a war in the body. It means time passes, but the injury does not always obey time. A veteran could have a normal morning, drink coffee, read the paper, wave to a neighbour, and then spend the afternoon fighting a memory triggered by the smell of wet earth after rain. He could laugh with grandchildren and then grow silent when one of them dropped a metal toy onto the floor. He could sit in a doctor's office filling out forms and find that a question about military service made his hands shake. The body kept score in small ways: a seat with the back to the wall, a quick scan of exits, irritation in crowds, trouble sleeping in complete darkness, trouble sleeping without darkness. A need to know where everyone was in the house, a refusal to talk about certain years, a sudden tenderness toward other veterans that no one else quite understood. These things were not always dramatic enough for outsiders to label as illness, but they shaped daily life. They determined where a man sat, how long he stayed, what he avoided, and how much of himself he could offer to the people who loved him. The physical body carried Vietnam in another way as well. Agent Orange and other herbicides made the war's aftermath literal for many veterans. During the war, the US military sprayed millions of gallons of tactical herbicides over parts of Vietnam to remove vegetation and deny enemy cover, and the Department of Veterans Affairs now recognizes a range of cancers and other diseases as presumptively connected to exposure to Agent Orange and related herbicides for eligible veterans. For years, many veterans argued that illnesses appearing long after service were connected to what they had encountered in Vietnam. They were not only fighting memory, they were fighting diabetes, cancers, neurological problems, heart disease, skin conditions, and the long struggle to be believed. The bitter pattern was familiar. First they were sent, then they came home changed, then they were doubted, then, after enough time, research, activism, lawsuits, and suffering, some of what they had been saying became official truth. That delay left marks of its own. Think about what that did to a veteran's sense of trust. A man had already learned in Vietnam that official language could be slippery. Progress could be announced while the war kept grinding on. Success could be counted in bodies while the larger purpose remained unclear. Then, back home, he might feel that the same kind of official distance followed him into hospitals and benefit offices. He knew what he'd been exposed to. He knew what he felt. He knew what had happened to friends from his unit. But knowing something in the body is not the same as proving it to an institution. Years could pass between illness and recognition. Claims could be denied. Conditions could worsen. Wives could become caregivers before anyone outside the family accepted that the war had entered their home again, this time through blood tests, biopsies, pills, hospital beds and medical bills. The wives and children carried Vietnam too, though not in the same way. They did not walk the patrols, but they lived with the patrols after they returned as nightmares. They did not hear the original mortar fire, but they saw what fireworks did to the man in the living room. They did not know the names of the dead friends because sometimes those names were never spoken, but they grew up around empty spaces those men had left. A wife might learn that love did not give her automatic access to the wound. A child might learn that a father could be kind and frightening, protective and unreachable, present and absent in the same evening. The household became the place where the war's unfinished business was managed without manuals. Do not wake him suddenly. Do not ask that question. Do not make too much noise behind him. Do not mention Vietnam when he has been drinking. Do not assume silence means peace. This does not mean every Vietnam veteran household was broken. That would be false and unfair. Many veterans became loving husbands, steady fathers, loyal friends, good neighbours, mentors, teachers, workers, ministers, counsellors and advocates. Many built lives of real meaning after Vietnam. Some spoke openly. Some healed through family, work, faith, therapy, service to other veterans, or simply the slow discipline of staying alive and choosing not to pass all of their pain forward. The story is not only one of damage, it is also one of endurance. But endurance should not be confused with being untouched. A man can function for decades while carrying a wound. He can show up to work, pay bills, coach Little League, attend weddings, mow the lawn, and still sit alone in the garage after everyone is asleep because the night has become difficult again. Civilian life can hide injury by rewarding performance. If the man keeps going, people assume he is all right. Many Vietnam veterans kept going because stopping felt more dangerous. As they aged, the war changed again. Retirement could remove the routines that had kept memories contained. Work had given some veterans structure, exhaustion, identity and distraction. When work ended, more silence entered the day. Aging brought illness, pain, death of friends, and more medical appointments. It brought time to think, and time is not always kind to traumatic memory. A man who had avoided the war through motion might find that old images returned more often when the body slowed down. News of later wars could trigger old feelings. Iraq, Afghanistan. Young soldiers again, in desert uniforms now, coming home with injuries that sounded familiar even when the geography was different. Vietnam veterans watched younger veterans struggle with roadside bombs, moral injury, repeated deployments, and the difficulty of returning to a country that thanked them more easily than it understood them. Some older veterans reached out. They had learned too late what silence cost, and they did not want younger men and women to wait decades for language. That may be one of the most important legacies of the Vietnam generation. They changed the vocabulary of war. Before them, the United States had many names for combat stress across different eras. Soldier's heart, shell shock, battle fatigue, war neurosis. But Vietnam forced a broader recognition that war trauma could last for decades, and that a soldier who came home physically whole might still be deeply wounded. PTSD became part of the official diagnostic language in 1980, and the VA's history of PTSD directly links that recognition to the experiences and advocacy surrounding returning Vietnam veterans and other trauma survivors. That was not an abstract medical victory. It changed how later soldiers would be evaluated, how families would understand symptoms, how clinicians would ask questions, and how the country would talk about invisible wounds. It did not fix everything. It did not prevent later generations from suffering. But it gave them a name earlier than Vietnam veterans had received it. There is a painful irony here. The generation that was told so often to be quiet became the generation whose suffering taught the country how to listen, at least a little better. Veterans who sat in early rap groups testified, wrote memoirs, challenged the VA, built organisations, stood beside the wall, spoke in classrooms, counselled younger veterans, and admitted publicly that the war had damaged them, helped break an older idea of manhood. They made it harder to pretend that courage means silence. They showed that a man can be brave in combat and still need help afterward. They showed that nightmares are not cowardice. They showed that grief can wear work boots, a baseball cap, a wedding ring, and a face that says nothing. They made American society confront the difference between surviving and returning. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial became one of the places where that confrontation happened. When it was dedicated in 1982, the black granite wall did not explain the war or resolve the arguments around it. It simply displayed the names of those who died or remained missing, arranged by the date of casualty. That simplicity mattered. Veterans could go there without being forced into someone else's speech. They could touch a name. They could stand in front of their own reflection and the names of the dead at the same time, which is a hard thing to describe and an even harder thing to experience. The living saw themselves in the stone among the dead. For some, it was the first time the country had given them a place where grief did not have to argue. People left letters, medals, boots, photographs, dog tags, cigarettes, and objects that meant nothing to strangers and everything to the person who placed them there. The wall became a public archive of private pain, but even the memorial could not contain all that was carried. A name on a wall marks a death. It cannot mark every life bent around that death. It cannot show the friend who survived and never slept normally again. It cannot show the wife who spent 30 years learning the geography of her husband's moods. It cannot show the son who grew up angry and later understood too late that his father had been fighting something invisible. It cannot show the veteran who drove across the country to visit the wall and then sat in his truck for an hour before he could step out. It cannot show the men who never went because they were afraid of what the names would do to them. The memorial is powerful, because it gives grief a place, but grief itself keeps moving through people. The Vietnamese carried the war in their bodies too, and no honest ending can leave them out. American veterans returned across an ocean, but Vietnamese civilians, soldiers, families and children lived on the land where the war had been fought. They carried bomb craters, missing relatives, destroyed villages, re-education camps, displacement, poverty, unexploded ordnance, chemical contamination, and memories of fear from more than one side. The American story of traumatized soldiers is real, but it sits inside a much larger Vietnamese story of national trauma. For an American veteran to remember a village is one kind of pain. For a Vietnamese family to have lived in that village, to have buried people there, to have lost land or health or children there is another. These truths do not cancel each other. They stand beside each other uneasily, as real history often does. Some veterans eventually returned to Vietnam, not all, and not for the same reasons. Some went seeking reconciliation. Some went because they could not stop thinking about a particular place. Some went with humanitarian groups, helping with medical work, schools, landmine projects, or efforts connected to Agent Orange. Some met former enemies. Some found that the country in memory and the country in front of them were not the same, and that realization shook something loose. Others never wanted to return. They had already spent enough of their lives there. Both responses make sense. Healing is not one road. For some men, returning helped them place the past in a real location, instead of carrying it as a private weather system. For others, the past was too dangerous to revisit. The generation aged, and with age came a different kind of reckoning. Young men who had once been unable to speak became old men who sometimes found speech urgent. They began telling grandchildren stories they had never told their own children. They brought out photographs. They attended reunions. They sat for oral histories. They corrected myths. They admitted fear. They cried in ways they had not allowed themselves to cry at 25 or 35. Some still did not speak. That silence deserves respect too, though not romanticizing. Sometimes silence is a choice. Sometimes it is a scar. Sometimes it is the only arrangement a person has made with pain that allows him to keep living. No one looking from the outside can always tell which it is. And this is where the story becomes less about one war and more about the cost of asking young people to carry history in their bodies. Wars are planned in rooms, justified in speeches, opposed in marches, studied in books, remembered in documentaries, and marked by anniversaries. But they are carried by people. A policy becomes a patrol. A theory becomes a frightened 19-year-old deciding whether to fire. A strategy becomes a village emptied before dark. A chemical program becomes a veteran's cancer diagnosis decades later. A body count becomes a face in a dream. A withdrawal date becomes an airport arrival that does not feel like home. That is the part history can lose if it moves too quickly. The body is where the large decisions land. So when we ask why the Vietnam War created a generation of traumatized soldiers, the answer is not only that combat was frightening, though it was. It is not only that the jungle was harsh, though it was. It is not only that the enemy was hard to see, though that mattered deeply. It is not only that the homecoming was cold or confused, though that made the wounds worse. It is all of it together. Young men were sent into a war with unclear lines, unclear progress, and unclear moral footing. They lived for months under constant threat from terrain, mines, ambush, and uncertainty. They were asked to act with power in places they did not fully understand. They watched friends die without always knowing what those deaths had purchased. They returned alone to a divided country that often wanted either to use them as symbols or avoid them entirely. Then they waited years for the medical language, public patience, and institutional recognition that might have helped them sooner. The result was a generation that carried Vietnam long after Vietnam had left the headlines. They carried it in VA waiting rooms, in marriages, in divorce papers, in police reports, in church pews, in factory shifts, in nightmares, in cancers, in reunions, in folded flags, in old photographs, in the way they watched the door, in the way they loved other veterans, in the way they sometimes could not love themselves. Some carried it heavily until the end. Some learned to set parts of it down. Some turned their pain into service. Some never found the help they needed. None of them came home to a country prepared to understand the full cost of what it had asked. And maybe that is the final lesson Vietnam left behind. Not a clean lesson, not one that fits on a memorial plaque, but one history forces us to face if we stay with it long enough. A war does not end when the shooting stops. It ends slowly, unevenly, inside the people who were there and inside the families who live beside them afterward. It ends in hospital rooms, therapy sessions, late apologies, old men touching names on a wall, children finally understanding their fathers, and veterans waking from dreams and reminding themselves again and again that they are not in the jungle anymore. For some, that reminder worked. For others, it never fully did. The generation that fought in Vietnam grew old, but the war they carried remained young in memory, still hot, still loud, still waiting in the body for a sound, a smell, a word, or a quiet hour when the past could return. That is why their story matters. Not because it is easy to hear, and not because it gives us a simple answer, but because it teaches us what war can do after the battlefield disappears, after the uniforms are put away, after the country stops watching, and after the men who survived are left alone with everything survival required of them.